The 19th Legion came into existence during the final decades of the Unification Wars, when the Emperor's gene-wrought armies swept across Terra to bring the techno-barbarian warlords and fractured nation-states under a single rule. Unlike some of the earlier legions that drew their recruits from specific geographic regions or warrior cultures, the 19th took their aspirants from the bombed-out hives and radiation-scarred wastelands, where conventional warfare had left populations hardened by generations of conflict. These were not the sons of nobility or tribal champions, but survivors from the ruins, young men who had learned to fight in the dark, to scavenge, to kill quietly and efficiently when resources were scarce, and every engagement meant life or death. The gene seed that created the 19th Legion originated from the genetic template of their absent Primarch, though the Emperor's scientists on Terra worked with incomplete data during those early years. The gestation pods beneath the Himalayan mountains had been breached decades earlier, and the infant Primarchs scattered across the galaxy through the warp. What remained were the carefully preserved genetic samples from which the Legion's Astartes would be forged. The 19th Legion's gene seed carried distinct characteristics even then, though the full implications would not become apparent until much later. The melanochrome organ, responsible for protecting Space Marines from radiation through skin pigmentation changes, functioned imperfectly in the 19th Legion's gene stock. Instead of the adaptive darkening seen in other legions, aspirants who survived the implantation process emerged with corpse-pale skin and eyes that darkened to solid black, as if the iris had expanded to consume the entire visible eye. These physical markers set them apart from their brother legions, but the Terran command structure cared little for appearance when the 19th consistently delivered results. Their early campaigns took them beyond Terra's atmosphere more frequently than most legions during the final Unification Wars. When the Emperor's forces needed to secure orbital platforms, asteroid fortresses, and the various void-based strongholds that warlords had established in the Sol system, the 19th Legion proved exceptionally capable. They adapted quickly to zero-gravity combat, to the confined spaces of ship corridors and station modules, and to the particular brutality of boarding actions, where a single hull breach could kill dozens in seconds. The 19th developed a reputation as void warfare specialists, though this designation only captured part of their tactical identity. Their Terran commanders recognized that their recruits' backgrounds in hive warfare translated effectively to ship-to-ship combat. Both environments demanded spatial awareness in 3 dimensions, an understanding of how to use limited cover, and the ability to strike from unexpected angles. The 19th became proficient at assault pod insertions, maglock approaches along ship hulls, and the rapid seizure of critical systems like bridge controls and reactor chambers. They learned to fight in environments where conventional tactics failed, where ammunition had to be conserved because resupply might not come for hours, and where a single well-placed demolition charge could accomplish what a full company assault could not. As the Great Crusade began and the Emperor's fleets pushed outward from Sol, the 19th Legion joined the expeditionary forces tasked with bringing human worlds back into compliance. Their operational doctrine under Terran command emphasized rapid insertion, surgical strikes against command structures, and the elimination of enemy leadership before conventional forces engaged. This approach stemmed partly from practical considerations. The 19th never achieved the numerical strength of legions like the Luna Wolves or the Ultramarines, so they learned to maximize the impact of smaller force deployments. Their commanders, all Terran-born veterans who had risen through the Legion's ranks, understood that 10 Space Marines hitting the right target could achieve more than 100 assaulting a fortified position. The compliance actions during these early decades of the Great Crusade took the 19th across multiple segmentums. They fought on Forge worlds where rebellious Mechanicum factions had to be eliminated without destroying critical infrastructure, requiring precision that many legions could not match. They deployed to feudal worlds where local warlords commanded armies numbering in the millions, and the 19th would decapitate the command structure in a single night operation, leaving the enemy forces leaderless and demoralized by dawn. On one particularly notable campaign, elements of the 19th Legion conducted simultaneous strikes across an entire star system, hitting 6 separate worlds within a 72-hour period. Each strike team eliminated the ruling authority and secured compliance before Imperial Army forces even made planetfall. The Legion's structure during this period reflected their Terran origins and the practical demands of their operational style. They organized into proto-companies that numbered between 80 and 120 Space Marines, smaller than the standard company formations that would later become common across the Legion's Astartes. Each proto-company maintained a degree of operational independence with its own command structure, specialized equipment loadouts, and tactical preferences developed through combat experience. Some proto-companies favored close-quarters blade work and bolt pistols for ship-boarding actions. Others specialized in long-range marksman tactics, with every battle brother trained to make precision shots at extreme distances. Still others focused on demolitions and siege breaking, carrying specialized equipment for breaching fortifications or sabotaging enemy infrastructure. Terran warrior culture influenced the 19th Legion's combat philosophy in ways both obvious and subtle. The Hive-born recruits brought with them an understanding that survival often meant remaining unseen, that the first strike frequently determined the outcome, and that resources should never be wasted on grand gestures when efficiency would suffice. This created a legion that valued pragmatism over glory, results over recognition. They did not seek to be remembered as heroes or champions. They sought to complete their objectives and move to the next campaign. Where other legions might announce their presence with orbital bombardments or massed assaults, the 19th preferred to infiltrate, eliminate key targets, and leave the enemy wondering what had happened until it was too late to mount effective resistance. The gene seed mutations became more pronounced as the Legion recruited new aspirants from compliant worlds during the Great Crusade. The pale skin and black eyes appeared consistently across all recruits regardless of their original ethnic background or homeworld. Some within the Legion viewed these features as marks of distinction, visual proof of their connection to their absent Primarch. Others simply accepted them as part of what it meant to be 19th Legion. The mutations caused no apparent combat effectiveness issues during this period, though Legion apothecaries noted higher rejection rates during the implantation process compared to some other legions. For every 3 aspirants who began the transformation, only one might survive to become a full battle brother. The Terran command cadre that led the 19th Legion maintained strict discipline and high operational standards. They drilled their warriors in every form of warfare: void combat, urban assault, wilderness operations, siege warfare, and counterinsurgency tactics. They emphasized adaptability, the ability to assess a situation quickly and adjust tactics accordingly. A 19th Legion strike force might deploy expecting a straightforward compliance action, and instead encounter a heavily fortified position defended by warriors equipped with Dark Age technology. The Terran commanders expected their battle brothers to evaluate the new situation, modify their approach, and complete the objective without requesting additional support or falling back to regroup. This self-sufficiency became a defining characteristic of the Legion's culture. They learned to operate with minimal logistical support, to repair their own equipment in the field, and to make do with whatever resources were available. When ammunition ran low, they fought with blades. When their armor was damaged and no tech marines were available, they performed field repairs themselves. When communications were severed and they received no new orders, they continued prosecuting their original objectives or identified new targets that would serve the overall campaign goals. The decades before reunification with their Primarch saw the 19th Legion participate in hundreds of compliance actions across the expanding Imperium. They fought alongside other legions on major campaigns and operated independently on secondary fronts. They earned respect from their brother legions for their reliability and effectiveness, though they never sought the spotlight or the glory that some legions craved. The 19th Legion did their duty, completed their assignments, and prepared for the next deployment. They were the Emperor's unseen blade, striking from shadows and vanishing before the enemy could respond, leaving only corpses and conquered worlds in their wake. The infant Primarch arrived on Lycius through circumstances that would shape everything he became. The moon orbited the gas giant Kievar, a world whose surface housed massive industrial complexes and forged cities that had survived Old Night intact. Lycius served as Kievar's prison moon, where the ruling tech guilds sent criminals, political dissidents, and anyone else deemed undesirable to work in the black mines that honeycombed the satellite's crust. The mines extracted rare minerals and radioactive ores that Kievar's industries required, and the prison population provided expendable labor for work that killed most within a few years of arrival. The child was found by prisoners in the deepest sections of the mine network, in tunnels where even the guards rarely ventured. The miners who discovered him understood immediately that this was no ordinary infant. He grew at an impossible rate, his physical development advancing in weeks what should have taken years. By the time he could walk, he stood taller than grown men. By the time he could speak, he possessed an intellect that grasped complex concepts with minimal explanation. The prisoners named him Corax, a word from ancient Terran languages meaning raven, after the black feathered birds that circled above the mine entrances. The black mines of Lycius existed in perpetual darkness, illuminated only by the dim glow of phosphorescent fungi and the occasional work lamp. The air hung thick with rock dust and chemical fumes from the refining processes. Prisoners worked in shifts that lasted until they collapsed from exhaustion, then slept in cramped dormitories carved from the rock itself. Food came in the form of nutrient paste dispensed from automated systems, barely sufficient to sustain life. Water was rationed. Medical care was non-existent. Guards from Kievar oversaw the operation through a combination of automated surveillance systems and periodic inspections, but they spent as little time in the mines as possible, preferring to monitor the prisoners remotely and intervene only when production quotas fell short. Corax grew up in this environment, learning the reality of slavery from direct experience. He worked alongside the other prisoners, his developing strength allowing him to move ore that would have required multiple men. The prisoners protected him as best they could during his early years, hiding him from the guards and teaching him everything they knew. Many of these prisoners were not common criminals, but political dissidents who had opposed the Tech Guild's rule on Kievar, educated men and women who had been sent to Lycius to die slowly in the dark. They taught the young Primarch about history, philosophy, and the nature of tyranny. They explained how the Tech Guilds maintained their power through control of technology and resources, how they used the prison moon to eliminate opposition and extract wealth simultaneously. The automated systems within the mines provided another source of education. Corax discovered that he could access data terminals that the prisoners used to receive work assignments and production quotas. His intellect allowed him to bypass security protocols that would have stymied trained technicians. He absorbed technical manuals, historical records, and strategic documents stored in the system's databases. He learned about warfare, logistics, and the operation of the industrial complexes on Kievar. He studied the guard rotations, the mine's layout, and the vulnerabilities in the prison's security systems. All of this information accumulated in his mind, forming the foundation for what would come later. The conditions in the mines killed prisoners constantly. Cave-ins buried work crews. Toxic gas leaks suffocated entire dormitory sections. Equipment malfunctions crushed or burned workers. The guards viewed these deaths as acceptable losses, easily replaced by new prisoners shipped up from Kievar. Corax witnessed this systematic destruction of human life and understood that it represented a fundamental evil. The Tech Guilds did not merely exploit the prisoners. They treated human beings as disposable resources, no different from the ore extracted from the rock. This recognition shaped his developing philosophy regarding freedom and tyranny. He concluded that any system built on the enslavement and dehumanization of others was inherently corrupt and must be destroyed. By the time Corax reached physical maturity, which occurred within a handful of years rather than decades, he had become a figure of respect and authority among the prison population. His strength was undeniable. He could tear through rock with his bare hands and lift support beams that required mechanical assistance for normal humans. His intellect impressed even the educated dissidents who had taught him. He possessed a natural ability to assess complex situations and identify solutions that others missed. The prisoners began to look to him for leadership, and Corax recognized that he could not remain passive while the system ground them into dust. The rebellion began not with a dramatic uprising, but with careful preparation. Corax organized the prisoners into cells, small groups that maintained operational security and could function independently if other cells were compromised. He identified individuals with specific skills, former soldiers who understood tactics, technicians who could sabotage equipment, and those who simply possessed the will to fight. He studied the guard patterns and identified the optimal times to strike. He accessed the mine systems and learned how to disable surveillance equipment, lock doors remotely, and manipulate the environmental controls. Every action was planned with precision, every risk calculated against potential gains. The initial strikes targeted the automated systems that maintained the prison's control structure. Corax led small teams that infiltrated critical junction points and planted improvised explosives crafted from mining charges. The explosions disabled surveillance networks across entire sections of the mine complex. Guard posts found themselves cut off from central command, unable to call for reinforcements or coordinate responses. Prisoner work teams overwhelmed isolated guards, seizing their weapons and equipment. Within the first hours of the uprising, Corax's forces controlled significant portions of the mine network. The Kievaran authorities responded by sending armed security forces to retake the mines. These guards came equipped with military-grade weapons and armor, confident that they could suppress what they viewed as a typical prison riot. They encountered something entirely different. Corax had transformed the prisoners into an effective guerrilla force that used the mine's geography to devastating advantage. The narrow tunnels negated numerical superiority and heavy weapons. The darkness that had oppressed the prisoners for years now became their ally. Corax's forces ambushed guard patrols, struck from unexpected angles, and vanished into side tunnels before reinforcements could arrive. They collapsed passages behind them, forcing the guards to take longer routes or risk being buried alive. Corax himself led from the front, his physical capabilities making him a terror in close combat. He moved through the tunnels with inhuman speed, his pale skin barely visible in the darkness before he struck. He killed guards with brutal efficiency, using their own weapons against them or simply tearing them apart with his hands when necessary. His presence inspired the freed prisoners and demoralized the enemy. Reports began filtering back to Kievar of a pale giant who struck like a ghost and could not be killed, who appeared wherever the fighting was thickest and left only corpses in his wake. The guerrilla campaign expanded beyond the initial uprising as Corax recognized that simply controlling the mines would not achieve lasting freedom. The tech guilds could seal the mine entrances and starve the rebels into submission, or simply bombard the moon's surface until the tunnel networks collapsed. True liberation required taking the fight to Kievar itself. Corax organized raids on the supply conveyors that transported ore from Lycius to the planet below. His forces seized shuttles and small spacecraft, turning the prison moon's limited transportation infrastructure into a fleet for planetary assault. The raids on Kievar targeted the tech guild's industrial complexes and military installations. Corax led strike teams that infiltrated forged cities under cover of darkness, sabotaged critical facilities, and assassinated guild leaders. He applied the lessons learned in the mines to urban warfare, using the industrial district's maze-like layouts the same way he had used the tunnel networks. His forces struck quickly, accomplished their objectives, and withdrew before the guilds could mount effective responses. Each successful raid freed more prisoners, seized more weapons, and demonstrated that the supposedly invincible tech guilds could be hurt. The campaign lasted months, a grinding conflict that saw Corax's rebel army grow from a few thousand freed prisoners to a force numbering in the tens of thousands. Former slaves from other facilities joined the rebellion. Citizens from Kievar's lower classes, inspired by the uprising, rose against their own oppressors. The tech guilds found themselves fighting on multiple fronts, their military forces stretched thin trying to suppress rebellions across the planet and defend against raids from Lycius. Corax coordinated these disparate resistance movements, providing tactical guidance and ensuring that strikes occurred simultaneously to prevent the guilds from concentrating their forces. The philosophical framework that guided Corax's actions during this period went beyond simple revenge or the desire for personal freedom. He articulated a vision of society built on principles fundamentally opposed to the Tech Guild's tyranny. He argued that freedom was not merely the absence of chains, but the presence of justice, that true liberation required not just overthrowing oppressors, but building systems that prevented new forms of tyranny from emerging. He insisted that the rebellion's methods mattered as much as its goals. They would not become the monsters they fought against. Prisoners who advocated for mass executions of captured guards or the indiscriminate destruction of civilian areas found themselves overruled by Corax, who maintained that their cause demanded they hold themselves to higher standards. This philosophical stance created tensions within the rebel movement. Some freed prisoners wanted blood revenge for years of suffering. Others argued that showing mercy to the enemy was weakness that would be exploited. Corax acknowledged these concerns, but refused to compromise on fundamental principles. He executed captured guards who had committed atrocities against prisoners, but he spared those who had simply followed orders. He authorized strikes against military and industrial targets, but forbade attacks that would cause mass civilian casualties. This approach sometimes cost tactical advantages, but it also ensured that the rebellion maintained moral legitimacy and continued to attract support from Kievar's population. The nature of warfare itself became a subject of Corax's analysis during the rebellion. He recognized that conventional military doctrine, which emphasized massed formations and direct confrontation, favored the side with superior resources and firepower. The Tech Guilds possessed both, which meant that fighting them on their terms guaranteed defeat. Guerrilla warfare inverted this dynamic by making the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. Large military formations became targets for ambush. Superior firepower meant nothing when the enemy could not find targets to shoot. Control of industrial infrastructure became a vulnerability when that infrastructure could be sabotaged or destroyed. Corax developed tactical principles that would later define the 19th Legion's combat doctrine. He emphasized the importance of intelligence gathering and reconnaissance, understanding that knowledge of enemy positions and capabilities enabled effective planning. He stressed the value of mobility and the ability to disengage from unfavorable battles, recognizing that preserving his forces mattered more than holding ground. He advocated for decentralized command structures that empowered subordinate leaders to make decisions based on local conditions rather than waiting for orders from above. These principles emerged from practical necessity during the rebellion, but reflected deeper insights about the nature of warfare that would prove applicable across countless battlefields. The Emperor's arrival on Lycius came as the rebellion reached its climax. The Tech Guilds had been pushed to the brink of collapse, their military forces depleted, and their control over Kievar crumbling. Corax had transformed the prison moon into a fortress and staging ground for the final assault that would break the Guild's power permanently. When the Emperor's fleet entered the system, initial reports suggested another threat that would need to be dealt with. Corax prepared to defend Lycius against what he assumed was an invasion force sent by some distant power to exploit the system's chaos. The meeting between the Emperor and his lost son occurred in the tunnels where Corax had spent his childhood. The Emperor came not with armies, but with a small retinue, walking into the heart of Lycius without apparent concern for the thousands of armed rebels who could have killed him. Corax recognized something in this figure, a connection that transcended rational explanation. The Emperor explained the truth of the Primarch's creation, the scattering through the warp, and the great crusade that was bringing humanity back together under a single rule. He offered Corax command of the 19th Legion, the Gene's sons who carried his genetic legacy and had been fighting across the galaxy in his absence. The bond that formed between them was immediate and profound. Corax saw in the Emperor a vision of humanity's potential that aligned with his own philosophical convictions about freedom and justice. The Emperor recognized in Corax a son who had already proven himself as both warrior and leader, who understood the realities of warfare and the importance of fighting for principles beyond mere conquest. The Emperor formally renamed Lycius as Deliverance, acknowledging what Corax had accomplished and establishing the Moon as the 19th Legion's new home world. The Tech Guilds of Kievar were brought into compliance with the Imperium, their power broken and their industrial capacity redirected towards supporting the Great Crusade. Corax's integration with the 19th Legion began with a comprehensive assessment of his gene son's capabilities and limitations. The Terran veterans had developed competence in void warfare and surgical strikes, but their tactical doctrine remained rooted in conventional space marine warfare adapted for smaller unit operations. Corax recognized immediately that his legion possessed the foundation for something more refined. The experiences on Lycius had taught him that warfare conducted from the shadows, where the enemy never saw the blade until it struck, achieved results that conventional assault tactics could not match. He intended to transform the 19th Legion into an instrument capable of prosecuting campaigns where the enemy would be defeated before they understood they were under attack. The philosophical underpinning of this transformation centered on a principle Corax articulated as swift and deadly. The phrase captured more than simple speed. It embodied a complete reimagining of how space marines should fight. Most legions approached warfare as a test of strength and endurance, where superior firepower and resilience would grind down any opposition. Corax rejected this framework as wasteful and inefficient. Every battle brother who died in a frontal assault represented a failure of planning and tactics. Every hour spent in prolonged engagement was an hour that could have been used striking elsewhere. The 19th Legion would not win through attrition or brute force. They would identify critical vulnerabilities in enemy positions, strike with overwhelming precision at those weak points, and withdraw before the enemy could mount effective counterattacks. This doctrine required fundamental changes to how the Legion trained, equipped, and organized itself. Corax spent months on Deliverance observing his gene sons in training exercises and combat simulations. He noted their strengths, the void warfare expertise, the comfort with operating in small units, the tendency toward practical solutions over elaborate tactics. He also identified areas where Terran training had not prepared them for the type of warfare he envisioned. The Terran veterans understood stealth as a preliminary phase before engagement, a way to achieve surprise in the opening moments of battle. Corax needed them to understand stealth as the fundamental state of operation, where remaining undetected was not a prelude to combat, but the primary objective itself. The training regimens on Deliverance evolved to reflect these priorities. Recruits underwent the standard implantation process and physical conditioning that created Space Marines, but the specialized training that followed diverged sharply from other legions' practices. Where other legions might spend weeks drilling in formation tactics and coordinated assaults, the 19th Legion's aspirants learned to move through terrain without leaving traces. They practiced remaining motionless for hours in uncomfortable positions, training their enhanced physiology to suppress even the subtle movements that might give away their presence. They studied how different environments affected sound propagation, learning to identify surfaces that would betray footsteps and those that would muffle them. Infiltration training took place in the rebuilt sections of Lycius's mine networks, which Corax had preserved specifically for this purpose. Aspirants entered the tunnels in full armor and equipment, tasked with reaching specific objectives without being detected by veteran battle brothers who knew every passage and hiding spot. The veterans used motion sensors, thermal imaging, and other detection equipment to hunt the aspirants. Those who were caught faced immediate critique of their mistakes, a footfall that echoed too loudly, a silhouette visible against a dim light source, the metallic scrape of armor against rock. The exercises continued until aspirants could navigate the entire tunnel network undetected, a process that sometimes took months of repeated attempts. Reconnaissance training emphasized observation and intelligence gathering over direct action. Aspirants learned to identify military installations from orbital imagery, recognizing the subtle patterns that distinguished command facilities from standard barracks or supply depots. They practiced estimating enemy force strength from partial information, the number of vehicles in a motor pool, the size of communication arrays, the configuration of defensive positions. They studied how to infiltrate enemy communications networks, not through sophisticated hacking, but through patient observation of message traffic patterns and frequencies. The goal was to create warriors who could spend days or weeks behind enemy lines, gathering information that would enable precise strikes by follow-on forces. Sabotage became another core competency. The 19th Legion's Battle Brothers learned to identify critical vulnerabilities in infrastructure and equipment. They studied power generation systems, understanding which components were essential and which were redundant. They learned to recognize ammunition storage facilities by their construction and placement, and to calculate the explosive force needed to destroy them completely. They practiced placing demolition charges in locations that would cause maximum disruption, not the obvious targets that enemy forces would guard, but the overlooked junction boxes and support structures whose destruction would cascade through entire systems. The psychological conditioning required for this type of warfare differed significantly from other Legion's mental training. Most Space Marines were conditioned to view themselves as the Emperor's wrath made manifest, unstoppable warriors who would never retreat or show weakness. Corax needed warriors who could suppress their aggressive instincts when the situation demanded patience. A battle brother lying in wait for the perfect moment to strike had to control the enhanced adrenal responses that made Space Marines so effective in direct combat. Warriors conducting reconnaissance missions had to resist the urge to engage enemy forces they encountered, understanding that maintaining their cover served the greater tactical objective. This conditioning created what some observers from other legions viewed as a contradiction: Space Marines who seemed less aggressive than their brothers in other legions, who would withdraw from battles they could win, who prioritized avoiding detection over achieving glory. The 19th Legion's warriors learned to view these perceptions as advantages. If the enemy expected Space Marines to behave in certain ways, deviating from those expectations created opportunities for exploitation. The psychological training included exercises where battle brothers had to abort missions despite being within moments of completing objectives, reinforcing the principle that tactical withdrawal was not failure, but a valid operational choice. Corax established specialized formations within the Legion to prosecute specific aspects of his doctrine. The Mordathan, whose name translated from an old Kievaran dialect as Shadow Masters, represented the apex of the Legion's stealth capabilities. These warriors underwent additional training beyond the standard regimen, spending years perfecting techniques that allowed them to operate in conditions where even other Raven Guard would struggle. The Mordathan could remain undetected at ranges where normal stealth would fail, their movements so controlled that even enhanced Auspex systems sometimes failed to register their presence. They carried specialized equipment that other formations did not use, including weapons designed for absolute silence and armor treated with coatings that absorbed sensor emissions. The Deliverers formed another distinct formation, specializing in close to medium-range firefights where precision mattered more than volume of fire. These warriors trained extensively with jump packs, learning to use vertical mobility to access positions that enemies would not anticipate or defend adequately. A Deliver squad might spend hours infiltrating to within a few hundred meters of their target, then use their jump packs for a final approach that lasted mere seconds, appearing above enemy positions and delivering devastating firepower before the enemy could react. Their weapons loadout emphasized bolt pistols and compact ranged weapons that could be fired accurately while airborne, along with close combat weapons for the inevitable melee that followed their initial assault. The Dark Furies represented Corax's answer to the need for shock assault capabilities within a legion focused on stealth. These warriors wore modified jump packs and specialized armor that incorporated lightning claws as integral weapon systems. The Dark Furies trained to identify high-value targets, enemy commanders, champion warriors, or critical defensive positions, and eliminate them through overwhelming close combat violence. Unlike other Legion assault units that might sustain their attacks for extended periods, the Dark Furies struck with absolute brutality for brief engagements, then withdrew to prepare for subsequent strikes. Their training emphasized the psychology of terror, understanding that witnessing their commanders torn apart by black armored warriors who appeared from nowhere and vanished just as quickly would shatter enemy morale more effectively than prolonged combat. The wargear that equipped these specialized formations reflected Corax's understanding that equipment should enable tactical approaches rather than compensate for tactical deficiencies. Reflex shields provided defensive capabilities without the bulk of traditional storm shields, using energy field technology to deflect incoming fire. The shield's compact size allowed warriors to maintain mobility and use two-handed weapons when needed, while still providing protection during approach phases when the Legion's forces would be most vulnerable. The technology was not simple to maintain. Reflex shields required frequent recalibration, and their power cells depleted faster than standard equipment, but the tactical advantages justified the logistical complications. Raven's talons, the specialized lightning claws that became synonymous with the Legion's assault elements, incorporated design principles that prioritized lethality over durability. The blades were thinner and longer than standard lightning claws, allowing them to penetrate armor at weak points rather than simply tearing through it. This design choice meant the weapons required more frequent maintenance and were more prone to damage if used incorrectly, but in the hands of properly trained warriors, they could kill with single strikes where other weapons would require multiple hits. The Raven's talons also incorporated power field generators that could be momentarily overcharged, increasing their cutting power for critical strikes at the cost of potentially burning out the weapon systems. The integration of Corax's guerrilla warfare experience with the Legion's existing void warfare expertise created a combined arms approach that other legions struggled to counter or replicate. Corax recognized that void warfare and planetary guerrilla operations shared fundamental principles. Both involved operating in environments where the enemy controlled most of the territory. Both required identifying critical objectives that could be struck with limited forces, and both demanded the ability to withdraw and reposition rapidly. The 19th Legion's battle doctrine evolved to treat these as complementary aspects of a unified operational approach rather than separate specializations. Boarding actions, which the Terran veterans had already mastered, became even more refined under Corax's guidance. The Legion developed tactics for approaching enemy vessels without being detected, using debris fields and censored dead zones to mask their approach vectors. Boarding teams learned to identify optimal breach points not through brute force analysis, but through understanding how ship systems were typically configured. A team might spend precious minutes studying a target vessel's external features to identify the location of critical systems, then breach directly into those spaces rather than fighting through multiple decks. The goal was to seize control of enemy ships before their crews understood they had been boarded, capturing vessels intact when possible or crippling them so completely that they could not threaten Imperial forces. Planetary operations benefited from similar analytical approaches. The 19th Legion's reconnaissance elements would identify enemy command structures, supply networks, and communication systems before the main force deployed. Strike teams would infiltrate days or weeks before the official compliance action began, positioning themselves near critical targets. When the assault commenced, these pre-positioned forces would strike simultaneously across the entire theater of operations, destroying enemy command posts, severing supply lines, and disrupting communications in coordinated attacks that left the enemy unable to mount organized resistance. By the time Imperial Army forces made planetfall, they often encountered enemies who were already defeated in everything but name, their command structure decapitated, and their ability to coordinate defenses eliminated. The doctrine also addressed the realities of fighting enemies who could not be defeated through conventional means. Xeno-species with superior technology or numbers, human civilizations that had maintained Dark Age weapon systems, or enemies who had fortified themselves so thoroughly that direct assault would result in unacceptable casualties. These scenarios required approaches that other legions might not consider. The 19th Legion learned to identify dependencies and vulnerabilities that were not immediately obvious. A fortress might be impregnable to direct assault, but dependent on a water purification system located outside its walls. An enemy army might possess overwhelming firepower, but rely on a single munitions depot for resupply. A xeno-civilization might have advanced weapons, but primitive logistical systems that could be disrupted through targeted strikes. Corax emphasized that this approach to warfare was not cowardice or an unwillingness to face the enemy directly. The 19th Legion's warriors were as capable in direct combat as any Space Marines, and they proved this repeatedly when circumstances demanded conventional engagements. The doctrine of stealth and shadow represented a choice to fight intelligently rather than simply fighting hard, to achieve objectives with minimum casualties and maximum efficiency. Every battle brother who survived a campaign could fight in the next one. Every hour saved through precise tactics was an hour that could be spent on another objective. The Great Crusade encompassed thousands of worlds and would take centuries to complete. The 19th Legion's approach to warfare was designed for this marathon rather than individual sprints. The training facilities on Deliverance expanded continuously as the Legion grew and recruited new aspirants from the Moon's population. The freed prisoners and their descendants provided recruits who already understood the principles that Corax valued: self-sufficiency, adaptability, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve freedom. These recruits required less psychological conditioning than aspirants from worlds where they had lived comfortable lives. They had seen tyranny firsthand and understood what they were fighting against. They brought with them the same determination that had driven the rebellion, now channeled into service with the Legion's Astartes. The 19th Legion's transformation under Corax's command manifested most clearly during the compliance actions that followed his reunification with his Gene sons. The Corrini Retribution stands as one of the earliest major campaigns where the Legion demonstrated its evolved doctrine on a strategic scale. The Corrini system had maintained independence through Old Night by fortifying 3 of its 5 inhabited worlds, to such an extent that conventional assault would have cost tens of thousands of Imperial Army casualties and potentially hundreds of Space Marine lives. The system's defensive coordinator, a military genius named Archstrategos Newman, had studied every major campaign of the Great Crusade and prepared countermeasures specifically designed to blunt Space Marine assault tactics. Newman's defensive strategy relied on overlapping fields of fire from fortified positions, extensive minefields and automated defense systems, and a mobile reserve force that could respond to breaches within minutes. He had positioned his command structure in a fortress complex on Corrini Secundus that was built into a mountain range, with multiple redundant communication systems and supply caches that would allow the fortress to withstand siege conditions for years. Intelligence gathered by Imperial forces before the 19th Legion's deployment suggested that taking the system would require a prolonged campaign involving multiple Legion elements and extensive Imperial Army support. Corax analyzed the intelligence reports and identified what other commanders had missed. Newman's defensive preparations were comprehensive but necessarily centralized. The Archstrategos personally coordinated defensive operations across all 3 fortified worlds through his command post on Corrini Secundus. The communication systems that enabled this coordination represented both the defensive network's greatest strength and its critical vulnerability. Rather than assault the fortified worlds directly, Corax deployed reconnaissance elements to map the communication infrastructure in detail. These teams spent weeks infiltrating the system, identifying relay stations, communication satellites, and the physical cables that connected ground installations. The actual assault began not with drop pods or orbital bombardment, but with simultaneous strikes against every major communication node in the Corrini system. More death-than-kill teams that had infiltrated weeks earlier activated demolition charges planted in relay stations. Saboteurs who had posed as civilian technicians destroyed critical components in satellite control facilities. Boarding parties seized communication ships in orbit and shut down their transmission capabilities. Within a span of 30 minutes, Archstrategos Newman found himself unable to communicate with his forces beyond the immediate vicinity of his command post. The fortified positions that had been designed to support each other through coordinated fire and mutual reinforcement became isolated strongpoints. Local commanders, trained to follow Newman's directives rather than exercise independent judgment, hesitated when they could not receive orders. The mobile reserves that should have responded to Imperial attacks remained in their staging areas because the commanders could not confirm where they were needed. Corax exploited this paralysis by deploying his forces against objectives that would have been suicide to attack under normal circumstances. Strike teams hit ammunition depots, knowing that the defenders could not call for reinforcement. Assault elements seized landing zones and held them against local counterattacks, confident that no coordinated response would materialize. The campaign that intelligence estimates suggested would take months concluded in 3 weeks. The fortified worlds fell not because their defenses were breached through frontal assault, but because their defenders could not coordinate their actions effectively. Arch-strategos Newman, isolated in his fortress with no way to influence the broader campaign, eventually surrendered when Raven Guard forces appeared at his command post, having infiltrated through maintenance tunnels that his defensive plans had not adequately secured. The Carini retribution demonstrated to the wider crusade what the 19th Legion could accomplish when properly employed, and it established patterns that would repeat across dozens of subsequent campaigns. The incident at Gate 42 occurred during a compliance action where the 19th Legion operated alongside the 4th Legion, the Iron Warriors commanded by Perdurabo. The target was a fortress complex designated Gate 42, built by a human civilization that had maintained advanced military technology through Old Night. The fortress controlled access to a resource-rich region that the Imperium needed for the Crusade's expansion, and its defenders had already repulsed 2 Imperial army assaults with heavy casualties. The War Council assigned both legions to the operation, expecting that their combined strength would overwhelm the defenders. Perdurabo approached the problem as an engineering challenge. He conducted detailed surveys of the fortress's structure, analyzed its defensive capabilities, and developed a comprehensive siege plan that would systematically reduce the fortifications through coordinated bombardment and assault. His plan was methodical and thorough, accounting for every defensive position and calculating the exact force requirements needed to breach each layer of fortifications. The Iron Warriors began their siege operations with the precision that characterized all of Perdurabo's campaigns, establishing artillery positions and preparing for an assault that would grind through the fortress's defenses over a period of weeks. Corax examined the same intelligence and reached different conclusions. The fortress's defenses were indeed formidable from the approaches that Perdurabo was preparing to attack, but the complex drew its power from a geothermal plant located several kilometers away and connected by underground conduits. The defenders had fortified the plant's surface facilities, but apparently believed the depth and complexity of the underground connection made it secure from infiltration. Corax proposed bypassing the fortress's main defenses entirely and striking at the power generation facility, calculating that without power, the fortress's automated defenses and life support systems would fail within hours. The disagreement between the two Primarchs became heated. Perdurabo viewed Corax's proposal as tactically unsound, arguing that infiltrating the geothermal plant would expose the strike force to unacceptable risk, and that even if successful, the fortress's defenders might have backup power systems that intelligence had not identified. He insisted that the methodical siege approach guaranteed success with calculable casualties, while Corax's plan introduced variables that could not be adequately controlled. Corax countered that Perdurabo's approach would cost lives unnecessarily and waste time that could be spent on other objectives. The fortress's defenders would eventually be starved out regardless of backup power systems once their main generation capacity was eliminated. Corax proceeded with his plan without waiting for Perdurabo's approval. A strike force of more Dathan and specialized infiltration units entered the underground conduits and fought their way to the geothermal plant through maintenance tunnels and service passages. The operation took 18 hours of brutal close-quarters combat in confined spaces where the Raven Guard's advantages in stealth were negated by the defenders' knowledge of the terrain. The strike force suffered casualties that would have been considered heavy for the 19th Legion's typical operations, but they succeeded in destroying the power plant's critical systems. The fortress's defenses went dark within hours, and its garrison surrendered after a brief negotiation rather than face slow death from life support failure. The success vindicated Corax's tactical approach, but it permanently damaged his relationship with Perturabo. The Iron Warrior's Primarch viewed the entire episode as insubordination and a personal insult. He had developed a comprehensive plan that would have succeeded, and Corax had essentially declared that plan inadequate by pursuing an alternative approach. The fact that Corax's method achieved results faster and with lower overall casualties somehow made the slight worse rather than better. Perturabo believed that warfare should be prosecuted through systematic application of superior force and engineering principles, while Corax's approach struck him as reckless improvisation that happened to succeed through luck as much as skill. The philosophical divide between the two Primarchs reflected deeper differences in how they understood warfare and leadership. Perturabo designed campaigns the way he designed fortifications, with every variable accounted for and every contingency planned. He valued certainty and control, the ability to predict outcomes through rigorous analysis. Corax operated from a framework that accepted uncertainty as inherent to warfare and sought to exploit it rather than eliminate it. He trusted his warriors to adapt to unexpected situations and make sound tactical decisions without detailed orders. These worldviews were fundamentally incompatible, and the incident at Gate 42 ensured that the two legions would rarely operate together in subsequent campaigns. The broader relationships between the 19th Legion and other legions during the Great Crusade varied significantly based on tactical philosophy and the personalities of the Primarchs involved. The Luna Wolves under Horus maintained cordial relations with the Raven Guard, though the two legions rarely operated together due to their divergent approaches. Horus appreciated Corax's effectiveness and understood the value of having Legion assets that could accomplish objectives through unconventional means. The War Master, as he would later become, recognized that the Great Crusade required different tools for different situations, and the Raven Guard represented a capability that complemented rather than competed with the Luna Wolves' direct assault doctrine. Corax and Horus developed a relationship built on mutual respect despite their differences in temperament and tactical preference. Horus possessed a charisma and political acumen that Corax lacked and did not particularly desire to cultivate. The Luna Wolves Primarch could navigate the complex politics of the War Council and manage relationships with the Mechanicum, Imperial Army Command, and the various other factions that comprised the Crusade's leadership structure. Corax preferred to focus on military operations and leave the political maneuvering to others. This dynamic worked to both Primarchs' advantage. Horus could rely on Corax to accomplish difficult objectives without requiring extensive oversight or political management, while Corax appreciated that Horus would defend the 19th Legion's operational independence when other commanders questioned their methods. The relationship with Jagatai Khan and the 5th Legion proved more substantial. The White Scars shared the Raven Guard's preference for mobility and rapid strikes, though they approached these principles from a different cultural and tactical foundation. Where the Raven Guard emphasized stealth and precision, the White Scars valued speed and overwhelming shock assault. Both legions understood that conventional grinding warfare wasted resources and lives, and both had developed doctrines that emphasized hitting the enemy where they were weakest rather than strongest. Corax and Jagatai found common ground in their shared skepticism of the rigid tactical orthodoxy that some legions practiced, and they occasionally coordinated operations where the White Scars' lightning raids would draw enemy forces out of position, while Raven Guard strike teams eliminated critical infrastructure. The relationship with Conrad Kurz and the 8th Legion occupied far more troubled territory. Both Primarchs had grown up in environments of extreme hardship and had led rebellions against tyrannical systems before the Emperor found them. Both commanded legions that operated from the shadows and struck with precision rather than brute force. The superficial similarities made the profound differences between them more disturbing to Corax. Kurz used terror as a weapon, deliberately cultivating fear through atrocities and public executions. The Night Lords left populations traumatized and broken, compliant through horror rather than conviction. Corax found this approach morally repugnant and tactically questionable. The methods he had used during the rebellion on Lycius had been brutal when necessary, but he had never embraced cruelty for its own sake. He had executed guards who committed atrocities, but he had not tortured them or displayed their bodies as warnings. The distinction mattered to him. Violence in service of liberation was justifiable, but violence that dehumanized both victim and perpetrator corroded the principles that made liberation meaningful. When he observed the Night Lords' operations or heard reports of their methods, he saw warriors who had allowed the darkness to consume them rather than wielding it as a tool. The few interactions between Corax and Kurz during the Great Crusade were tense and uncomfortable. Kurz seemed to view Corax as naive, someone who refused to accept the harsh realities of what the galaxy required. Corax saw Kurz as a cautionary example of what he could have become if he had allowed his anger and his experiences in the mines to define him completely. The Night Haunter had let his suffering transform him into something monstrous, while Corax had chosen to remain human despite everything he had endured. This fundamental divide meant that the two legions avoided joint operations whenever possible, and their primarchs maintained professional distance that barely concealed mutual distrust. Within the 19th Legion itself, the command structure that emerged during the Great Crusade reflected both the Terran traditions and Corax's influence. Commander Bran Nev represented the Terran Old Guard, a warrior who had served with the Legion since its earliest campaigns during the Unification Wars. Bran had commanded void warfare operations before Corax's arrival and continued to lead the Legion's fleet actions after reunification. He adapted to the new doctrine with the pragmatism that characterized the Terran veterans, recognizing that Corax's methods achieved results and that resistance to change would be both futile and counterproductive. Bran became one of Corax's most trusted subordinates, responsible for coordinating the Legion's naval assets and ensuring that fleet operations supported ground campaigns effectively. Commander Agapito, a Deliverance native who had fought in the rebellion as a young man before becoming one of the first recruits from the liberated moon, represented the new generation of Raven Guard leadership. Agapito had internalized Corax's philosophy completely, having lived through the oppression that shaped the Primarch's worldview. He commanded ground operations with an aggressive confidence that sometimes concerned the more cautious Terran veterans, but his understanding of guerrilla warfare tactics was instinctive rather than learned. Agapito could assess complex tactical situations rapidly and identify opportunities that others might miss, making him invaluable for operations that required immediate decision-making without waiting for orders from higher command. The dynamic between the Terran veterans and the Deliverance recruits created productive tension within the Legion. The Terrans brought institutional knowledge and experience from decades of campaigning across the galaxy. They understood void warfare, the logistics of sustained operations, and the political realities of operating within the broader Imperial military structure. The Deliverance recruits brought passion and a deep commitment to the principles that Corax embodied. They understood why they fought, not just how to fight, and this philosophical grounding gave them resilience in situations where warriors motivated purely by duty might falter. Other notable commanders included Aloni Tev, who specialized in coordinating multi-theater operations and had developed the communication protocols that allowed dispersed Raven Guard forces to maintain operational coordination despite being separated by vast distances. Salion of the Mordathan led the Shadow Masters in their most dangerous infiltration missions, a warrior whose skills in stealth warfare were legendary even among a legion of stealth specialists. Keeds next commanded the Deliverers and had pioneered many of the jump pack assault tactics that became standard across the Legion's rapid assault formations. The campaigns prosecuted by the 19th Legion during the Great Crusade took them across multiple segmentums and exposed them to every variety of warfare the galaxy could offer. They fought Xeno species, whose technology and biology seemed designed specifically to counter Space Marine advantages. They brought human civilizations into compliance when those civilizations possessed weapons from the dark age of technology that could threaten even legions Astartes. They conducted counterinsurgency operations on worlds where the enemy blended seamlessly with civilian populations. They eliminated rogue psyker cults whose powers made conventional military force ineffective. Each campaign added to the legion's institutional knowledge and refined their tactical doctrine. The Battle Brothers learned to recognize patterns across different enemies and environments, developing an intuitive understanding of how to approach new situations based on accumulated experience. The Legion's librarians, those Battle Brothers who possessed psychic abilities, became specialists in gathering intelligence through their powers, using precognition and telepathy to identify enemy plans and dispositions. The Tech Marines developed expertise in sabotage and the rapid assessment of technological systems, able to identify vulnerabilities in enemy equipment and infrastructure with minimal observation. The reports from Istvan III reached the War Master's fleet as fragmented Vox transmissions and garbled distress calls that painted an incomplete picture of catastrophe. Horus Lupercal, recently elevated to the position of War Master and granted supreme command over the Emperor's military forces, had turned against the Imperium. The details remained unclear in those first hours. Some transmissions spoke of virus bombing, others of space marines firing upon their own brothers. What was certain was that elements of 4 legions had been deployed to the surface of Istvan III and subsequently attacked by their own fleets in orbit. The World Eaters, Emperor's Children, Death Guard, and Sons of Horus had purged their own ranks, eliminating those warriors whose loyalty to the Emperor could not be questioned. The scale of the betrayal defied immediate comprehension. The War Master himself, the Emperor's chosen instrument for prosecuting the Great Crusade, had orchestrated the murder of thousands of space marines who had served loyally for decades. The virus bombing alone represented a war crime of staggering magnitude. Entire cities had been reduced to lifeless wastelands, their populations killed in minutes by biological weapons that the Imperium had agreed to use only in the most extreme circumstances. That Horus would deploy such weapons against his own warriors indicated that whatever had corrupted him ran deeper than simple ambition or political disagreement. Terra's response came swiftly once the scope of the rebellion became clear. The Emperor dispatched 7 legions to bring Horus to account and end the insurrection before it could spread. The initial assault wave would consist of 3 legions, the Iron Hands under Ferrus Manus, the Salamanders commanded by Vulcan, and the Raven Guard led by Corax. These forces would make planetfall on Istvan V, where Horus had established his base of operations after the slaughter on Istvan III. 4 additional legions would form a second wave, deploying after the initial assault had secured landing zones and begun engaging the traitor forces. The Word Bearers, Night Lords, Iron Warriors, and Alpha Legion would provide reinforcement and ensure that Horus could not escape the system. The strategic logic appeared sound. 7 legions represented overwhelming force, more than sufficient to crush 4 rebel legions, even accounting for the defensive advantages Horus would possess. Ferrus Manus, whose Iron Hands had maintained a close relationship with the Sons of Horus throughout the Great Crusade, demanded the honor of leading the first wave. His anger at Horus's betrayal was personal. He had considered the War Master a friend, and could not reconcile that friendship with the atrocities committed at Istvan III. Ferrus intended to confront Horus directly and either bring him back to Terra in chains or kill him for his treachery. Corax approached the deployment with characteristic caution. The intelligence available to the Loyalist forces was limited and potentially compromised. They knew that Horus controlled Istvan V and had fortified positions across the planet's surface, but the specific disposition of traitor forces remained unclear. The Raven Guard's reconnaissance elements had not been able to infiltrate the system before the assault. Horus had established comprehensive security measures that made covert insertion impossible in the time available. This lack of detailed intelligence troubled Corax, who preferred to understand the battlefield thoroughly before committing his forces. Operating without proper reconnaissance violated fundamental principles of his tactical doctrine. The concerns he raised during planning sessions with Ferrus Manus and Vulcan received acknowledgement, but did not alter the operational timeline. Ferrus insisted that speed was essential. Every day they delayed gave Horus more time to fortify his positions and potentially corrupt additional legions. The Iron Hands Primarch believed that overwhelming force applied rapidly would shatter the traitor defenses regardless of their specific configuration. Vulcan shared Ferrus's urgency, though his motivations stemmed from different reasoning. The Salamander's Primarch understood that the longer the rebellion continued, the more lives would be lost on both sides. He hoped that a decisive victory at Istvan V might convince other potentially wavering legions that resistance to the Emperor's justice was futile. The approach to Istvan V proceeded according to the established plan. The 3 legions of the first wave translated from the warp at the system's edge and began their approach to the 5th planet. Augur readings confirmed extensive fortifications on the surface and a substantial fleet in orbit, though smaller than the combined strength the Loyalists had brought. Horus's forces did not contest the Loyalist approach, instead withdrawing to the planet's surface and allowing the Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard to achieve orbital supremacy. This tactical decision made sense from a defensive standpoint. The traitor fleet could not win a void engagement against 3 full legions, and preserving those ships for potential evacuation was more valuable than sacrificing them in a losing battle. The primary landing zone designated for the assault was a volcanic plain designated the Urgal Depression. The terrain was barren and exposed, offering little cover but providing adequate space for the deployment of 3 legions and their supporting equipment. Ferrus Manus insisted on leading the assault personally, deploying with the first wave of drop pods and stormbirds. The Iron Hands would strike at the center of the traitor positions, while the Salamanders and Raven Guard would anchor the flanks and prevent the enemy from enveloping the Loyalist forces. Once the initial landing was secure, the second wave would deploy, and the combined force would advance on the traitor strongholds. Corax positioned his legion on the northern flank of the deployment zone. The Raven Guard's approach differed from their usual infiltration tactics by necessity. This was a conventional assault where stealth offered limited advantages. The entire planet knew they were coming, and the landing zones were exposed enough that achieving surprise was impossible. The Primarch adapted his deployment to emphasize mobility and the ability to exploit opportunities as they emerged. Rather than concentrating his forces in a single formation, he dispersed the Raven Guard across multiple landing sites within the designated zone. This approach would allow individual companies and battalions to maneuver independently and respond to developing situations without waiting for orders from central command. The initial descent encountered immediate resistance. Traitor forces had positioned anti-aircraft batteries across the Urgal Depression, and these weapons opened fire as soon as the Loyalist drop pods and aircraft entered their range. The sky filled with explosions and tracer fire as thousands of Space Marines made planetfall under combat conditions. Drop pods slammed into the volcanic soil and disgorged their passengers into a maelstrom of incoming fire. Stormbirds and Thunderhawks attempted to land their cargoes of troops and equipment while evading missiles and Law's fire from ground positions. The Raven Guard's dispersed deployment proved advantageous during these initial moments. Rather than presenting concentrated targets, the Legion's forces landed across a broad front that forced the traitor gun positions to divide their fire. Individual companies touched down and immediately moved to engage the nearest enemy positions, using speed and aggression to close the distance before defensive fire could inflict catastrophic casualties. The pale-skinned warriors in black armor flowed across the volcanic plain, their training in rapid assault tactics serving them well despite the unconventional nature of the deployment. Corax's command Stormbird landed near the center of the Raven Guard's deployment zone, and the Primarch emerged into a battlefield that stretched for kilometers in every direction. The Urgal Depression was a hellscape of black volcanic rock and ash fields, broken by occasional ridges and the skeletal remains of ancient structures. The traitor forces had fortified these ridges and ruins, creating defensive positions that commanded fields of fire across the approaches. The Loyalist forces were advancing under sustained fire from these positions, taking casualties but maintaining momentum through sheer determination and the resilience that made Space Marines so effective. The Iron Hands in the center pushed forward with mechanical precision, their advance coordinated through tactical data links and supported by armored vehicles that had deployed from heavy landers. Ferrus Manus led from the front, his silver hands, the result of a trial on Medusa where he had plunged his arms into living metal, reflecting the volcanic landscape's ruddy light. The Iron Hands Primarch was a figure of unstoppable momentum, smashing through defensive positions and driving his legion forward toward the traitor strongholds visible in the distance. The Salamanders on the southern flank advanced more deliberately, their focus on maintaining formation integrity and supporting their battle brothers with devastating firepower. Vulcan's Genesons carried heavy weapons in greater proportion than most legions, and they used this firepower to suppress traitor positions while assault elements closed for melee engagement. The Salamander's advance was slower than the Iron Hands but more methodical, leaving no enemy positions intact in their wake. The Raven Guard's role on the northern flank required them to maintain pace with the other two legions, while also securing that portion of the battlefield against potential flanking attacks. Corax coordinated his forces through Vox communication with his commanders, directing companies toward objectives that would support the overall advance. The Legion's experience with decentralized operations proved valuable. Individual commanders made tactical decisions based on local conditions without requiring detailed orders from the Primarch, allowing the Raven Guard to adapt to the fluid battlefield more rapidly than more rigidly structured legions might have managed. The first hours of combat proceeded according to the operational plan despite the fierce resistance. The Loyalist forces pushed the traitors back from their initial defensive positions and began advancing toward the primary fortifications. Casualties were significant, but within acceptable parameters for an assault of this scale. The three Primarchs maintained communication throughout the engagement, coordinating their advances and ensuring that no gaps opened in the Loyalist lines that the enemy could exploit. The second wave was scheduled to deploy once the first wave had secured sufficient territory to provide safe landing zones away from the heaviest defensive fire. The word bearers arrived first, their drop pods screaming down through the atmosphere to land behind the Loyalist positions. The 17th Legion deployed in the areas that the first wave had already secured, their arrival announced by Vox communication confirming their successful landing. The Night Lords followed minutes later, their black armored warriors emerging from drop pods decorated with images of flayed skin and skulls. The Iron Warriors made planetfall on the southern flank, their gray and yellow armor distinctive even at a distance. The Alpha Legion deployed last, their positions scattered across the entire rear area of the Loyalist deployment zone. The betrayal began with coordinated fire from all four legions of the second wave. Bolter fire and heavy weapons opened up on the Loyalist forces from behind, catching the Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard in a crossfire between the traitor forces they had been advancing against and their supposed reinforcements. The scale of the treachery became apparent within seconds. This was not a tragic mistake or miscommunication, but a planned execution. The four legions of the second wave had coordinated their deployment to maximize the devastation they could inflict on the Loyalists who had believed they were allies. The Urgal Depression became a killing ground. The Loyalist forces found themselves trapped between enemies on all sides, their formations disrupted, and their command structure struggling to respond to a situation that should have been impossible. Space Marines who had fought together during the Great Crusade now killed each other, with the same weapons and tactics they had used against the Imperium's enemies. The Word-Bearers bolters cut down Salamanders, who had turned to face this unexpected threat. Night Lords' chainswords tore into Iron Hands, who were still trying to understand what was happening. Iron Warriors' heavy weapons fire shredded Raven Guard positions that had been oriented toward the original enemy. Corax understood the tactical situation immediately. The Raven Guard were being systematically destroyed by enemies who knew their capabilities and had planned specifically to counter them. The Alpha Legion in particular seemed to have positioned themselves to block the routes that the Raven Guard would naturally use for withdrawal or repositioning. Every tactical doctrine that Corax had developed, every principle of maneuver warfare and rapid assault, became a liability when the enemy knew those doctrines and had prepared counters in advance. The Primarch's immediate priority was preserving as many of his gene sons as possible. The battle was lost. No amount of courage or tactical brilliance could overcome being caught between 4 legions who had achieved complete surprise. Continuing to fight in the Urgal Depression would result in the total annihilation of the Raven Guard. Corax began issuing orders for a fighting withdrawal, directing his forces to disengage from combat and move toward the northern edge of the depression, where the terrain offered more cover and the enemy encirclement was weakest. The withdrawal proceeded under catastrophic conditions. Raven Guard companies that attempted to disengage found themselves targeted by concentrated fire from multiple directions. The Alpha Legion had positioned blocking forces along the most obvious withdrawal routes, forcing the Raven Guard to fight through prepared positions while under fire from behind. Individual squads and companies became isolated from the main force, surrounded and destroyed by traitor forces that outnumbered them heavily. The volcanic plain became littered with the bodies of black armored warriors, their pale skin stained with blood and ash. Ferrus Manus refused to withdraw. The Iron Hands Primarch saw the betrayal as a personal insult that could only be answered with the blood of traitors. He rallied elements of his legion and launched a counterattack toward the traitor positions, believing that aggressive action might break the encirclement and allow the loyalist forces to regroup. Vulcan attempted to coordinate a more organized withdrawal of the Salamanders, but the speed of the collapse and the confusion caused by fighting former allies made effective command nearly impossible. The 3 legions that had deployed as a unified force were fragmenting into isolated groups fighting for survival rather than executing any coherent tactical plan. The Raven Guard's casualties mounted with every minute. Companies that had landed at full strength were reduced to squads. Squads became individual survivors fighting alone or in pairs. The Legion's command structure began to collapse as captains and commanders were killed or cut off from communication. Corax maintained contact with as many elements as possible, but the Vox network was becoming increasingly fragmented as relay equipment was destroyed and the background noise of battle overwhelmed communication channels. The Raven Guard who escaped Istvan V arrived at Deliverance as broken fragments of what had been a proud legion. Of the approximately 80,000 warriors who had deployed to the Urgal Depression, fewer than 3,000 survived. The casualties were not merely numerical. The Legion had lost its command structure, its veteran sergeants, its specialized formations that had taken decades to develop. The Mordathan were effectively extinct, with perhaps a dozen survivors scattered across the fleeing ships. The Deliverers and Dark Furies had been annihilated almost completely. The Tech Marines, Apothecaries, and Librarians, who formed the Legion's institutional backbone, had died in proportions that threatened the Raven Guard's ability to function as a military force. Corax himself bore wounds that would have killed a normal Space Marine several times over. The fighting withdrawal from the Urgal Depression had required the Primarch to personally hold positions while his Gene sons evacuated, standing alone against traitor forces that should have overwhelmed him through sheer numbers. His armor was scored and cracked, the black ceramite marked by bolter impacts and energy weapon burns. One of his lightning claws had been damaged beyond field repair, the power field generators burned out from sustained use. The Primarch's pale skin was covered in lacerations and burns, though his enhanced physiology was already beginning to heal the worst of the damage. The survivors who made it off Istvan V did so through a combination of desperate fighting and the sacrifice of those who stayed behind to buy time for others to escape. Some Raven Guard had seized traitor vessels through boarding actions, killing the crews and using the captured ships to break orbit. Others had fought their way to Loyalist landing craft and Thunderhawks, cramming dozens of warriors into spaces designed for half that number. A few had simply fled into the wilderness beyond the Urgal Depression and evaded traitor patrols until they could signal for extraction. The retreat had no coordination or planning. It was pure survival instinct, individual warriors and small groups making whatever choices gave them the best chance of living through the next hour. The journey back to Deliverance took weeks as the scattered survivors regrouped and linked up with Legion fleet elements that had remained in orbit during the initial assault. The ships that escaped Istvan V were damaged and undermanned, their crews decimated, and their systems strained beyond normal operational parameters. Several vessels had to be abandoned when their reactors failed or their life support systems collapsed. The survivors transferred to other ships, consolidating their numbers while abandoning hulks that would never make it to a safe port. By the time the remnants of the 19th Legion reached their home system, they had lost additional warriors to injuries sustained during the massacre, bringing their effective strength below 3,000 combat-capable Space Marines. Deliverance received them in silence. The population of the liberated moon understood what the Raven Guard's decimation meant for the wider Imperium. If Space Marines could betray each other on this scale, if Primarchs could turn against the Emperor, then the certainties that had defined the Great Crusade were shattered. The civilians who had once been slaves looked at the returning warriors and saw defeat written in every movement, every expression. These were not the confident liberators who had departed months earlier. These were survivors of a catastrophe, traumatized and broken in ways that went beyond physical wounds. Corax isolated himself in the fortress monastery that overlooked the primary settlement on Deliverance. For 3 days he remained alone, speaking to no one and accepting no visitors. The Primarch needed time to process what had happened and to determine how the Legion could continue to function. The tactical aspects were straightforward enough to analyze. The Raven Guard lacked the numbers to prosecute campaigns independently, and rebuilding through normal recruitment would take decades. The strategic situation was more complex. The Imperium was now engaged in civil war, with Horus commanding at least 8 legions against the Emperor's loyalist forces. Every day that the Raven Guard remained combat ineffective was a day they could not contribute to the war effort. The psychological damage to the survivors represented perhaps the greatest challenge. Space Marines were conditioned to believe in their own superiority, their invincibility when properly deployed. The massacre had shattered that confidence. Warriors who had fought without hesitation during the Great Crusade now questioned their own capabilities. They had been ambushed by enemies who knew their tactics intimately, who had planned specifically to counter everything the Raven Guard did well. The Alpha Legion in particular had demonstrated knowledge of Raven Guard doctrine that should have been impossible for outsiders to possess. This suggested infiltration at a level that made every survivor wonder if there were traitors still hidden within their ranks. When Corax emerged from his isolation, he had made his decision. The Raven Guard would rebuild, but not through conventional means. Normal recruitment and training took years to produce a single Space Marine, and the attrition rate meant that only a fraction of aspirants survived to become full battle brothers. The Legion needed warriors immediately, and in numbers that would allow them to return to combat effectiveness within months rather than decades. This requirement demanded access to technology and knowledge that the Mechanicum had lost or deliberately suppressed during the Age of Strife. The Primarch departed for Terra with a small honor guard, leaving Commander Bran in charge of the Legion's remaining forces. The journey to the Throne World took weeks through warp routes that had become increasingly unstable as the heresy spread. Traitor forces controlled multiple systems along the most direct routes, forcing the Raven Guard ships to take circuitous paths that added time to the voyage. The small fleet that accompanied Corax's flagship included vessels that were barely functional, held together by emergency repairs and the desperate efforts of understaffed engineering crews. Terra itself had transformed in the months since the heresy began. The Imperial Palace had become a fortress, its defenses expanded and reinforced as Rogel Dorn directed the fortification of the entire planet. The 7th Legion had returned to Terra and taken responsibility for defending humanity's birthworld against the inevitable assault that would come when Horus turned his attention to the ultimate prize. The Throne World's population lived under martial law, with rationing and conscription affecting every aspect of civilian life. The optimism that had characterized the Great Crusade's height had been replaced by grim determination and the understanding that the Imperium faced an existential threat. Corax's audience with the Emperor took place in the same laboratory complexes beneath the Himalayan mountains, where the Primarchs had originally been created. The Emperor had withdrawn from active military command to focus on a project whose nature remained secret even from most of the Primarchs. Malcador, the sigillite, managed the day-to-day governance of the Imperium, while the Emperor worked in isolation on something he believed would turn the tide of the war. The Master of Mankind's decision to seclude himself while the Imperium burned had caused tension with several Primarchs, but Corax was not among those who questioned the Emperor's judgment. The laboratory where they met contained equipment whose purpose Corax could only partially comprehend despite his enhanced intellect. Gene forges and biosculptors lined the walls, their surfaces covered in readouts displaying information in formats that predated the Age of Strife. Stasis chambers held genetic samples in conditions that would preserve them for millennia. The air smelled of chemical preservatives, and the ozone tang of high-energy equipment operating at the edge of safe parameters. This was where the Primarchs had been created, where the Emperor had worked for decades to produce his 20 gene-forged sons. The Emperor listened as Corax explained the situation and his proposed solution. The Raven Guard needed accelerated gene seed implantation technology that would allow them to create new Space Marines in a fraction of the normal time. The Primarch knew that such technology existed. The Emperor had used it during the Unification Wars when the first Space Marine legions were being created. The techniques had been abandoned later as too risky, with high failure rates that were acceptable during Terra's desperate wars, but unacceptable once the legions were established. Corax argued that the current situation was equally desperate, and that the risk of failure was preferable to remaining combat ineffective. The Emperor's response came not in words, but through direct psychic communication that bypassed language entirely. The Master of Mankind conveyed understanding of the situation and agreement that the Raven Guard needed extraordinary measures to rebuild. He also communicated warnings about the dangers inherent in what Corax proposed. The gene tech that would enable rapid Space Marine creation was powerful and complex, derived from the Emperor's own genetic engineering work during the Dark Age of technology. In the wrong hands, or if improperly implemented, it could produce results far worse than simple failure, mutations, instability, and creatures that bore only superficial resemblance to proper Space Marines. The Emperor led Corax deeper into the laboratory complex, to chambers that had been sealed since the Primarch's creation. Here were stored the pure genetic templates from which the Space Marine gene seed had been derived, samples that contained the Emperor's own genetic work without the degradation that centuries of replication had introduced. These templates represented the original vision of what Space Marines should be, before the practical compromises and modifications that had occurred during the Legion's development. Access to this material would allow the Raven Guard to create gene seed that was more stable and potent than what they currently used. The technology that accompanied these genetic templates was equally impressive. The Emperor provided Corax with data cores containing complete specifications for accelerated implantation procedures, including the equipment designs and biochemical formulas needed to implement them. The process would still require Raven Guard gene seed as a foundation. The templates alone could not create Space Marines without the specific genetic markers that made a warrior part of the 19th Legion. But by combining the pure templates with existing gene seed and applying the accelerated implantation procedures, the Raven Guard could potentially create new warriors in months rather than years. The Emperor's final gift was perhaps the most significant. He shared with Corax a portion of his own understanding of genetic engineering, directly imprinting knowledge into the Primarch's mind through psychic means. This was not complete comprehension of all the Emperor's work, which would have been impossible even for a Primarch to absorb, but rather a focused understanding of the specific techniques and principles relevant to the Raptor project. Corax emerged from this psychic transfer with knowledge that would have taken decades to acquire through study, though the experience left him with splitting headaches that lasted for days. The return journey to Deliverance proceeded with greater urgency than the outbound trip. Corax carried with him genetic material and technology that represented humanity's most advanced understanding of biological engineering. The security around these materials was absolute. Only the Primarch and his most trusted apothecaries knew the full extent of what had been obtained from Terra. The risk of this knowledge falling into traitor hands was unacceptable, and Corax implemented protocols that would destroy the genetic templates completely if the ship was boarded or faced imminent capture. Deliverance's fortress monastery became the center of frantic activity as the Raven Guard prepared to implement the Raptor project. The name came from the Legion's own iconography and represented both continuity with their identity and a new beginning. The Raptors would be accelerated development Space Marines created using the Emperor's gene tech, warriors who would restore the Legion's combat strength and allow them to return to the war. The Apothecarium was expanded and reorganized to accommodate the new equipment that Corax had brought from Terra. Gene forges were constructed according to specifications that required materials and components the Mechanicum normally restricted to the highest priority projects. The selection of aspirants for the first generation of Raptors followed different criteria than normal recruitment. The accelerated implantation process placed extreme stress on the recipient's body and mind, with failure rates that were expected to be significantly higher than standard procedures. The apothecaries selected aspirants who showed exceptional physical resilience and psychological stability, understanding that many would not survive the process. The population of Deliverance volunteered in numbers that exceeded what the Legion could process. Thousands of young men and women sought the honor of becoming Raven Guard, knowing the risks and accepting them willingly. The first implantations began 3 months after Corax's return from Terra. The process differed substantially from normal Space Marine creation. Rather than implanting gene seed organs sequentially over a period of years, the Raptor procedure introduced multiple organs simultaneously using the pure genetic templates to stabilize the recipient's physiology. Chemical treatments and hormonal regulators accelerated the body's adaptation to the new organs, compressing years of development into months. The aspirants spent most of this time in medically induced comas, their bodies maintained by automated systems while the transformation proceeded. The early results exceeded expectations. Aspirants who entered the gene forges as normal humans emerged months later as fully developed Space Marines, their bodies transformed by the accelerated process. These Raptors showed physical capabilities comparable to standard Raven Guard, with the same pale skin and black eyes that marked all of Corax's gene sons. Their psychological conditioning had proceeded more quickly than normal, but appeared stable, with the new warriors demonstrating appropriate discipline and understanding of Legion doctrine. Initial combat trials showed that the Raptors could fight effectively, their enhanced physiology responding to training with the same rapid improvement that characterized all Space Marines. The success of the first generation led to expansion of the program. More gene forges were constructed, and additional apothecaries were trained in the accelerated implantation procedures. The rate of Raptor creation increased from dozens to hundreds, with new warriors emerging from the transformation chambers every week. The Legion's strength began to recover as these fresh forces joined the survivors of Istvan V. Within 6 months of the project's initiation, the Raven Guard had added over 1,000 new warriors to their ranks, with projections suggesting they could reach 10,000 within a year if the current production rate continued. The Raptors themselves showed some variations from standard Space Marines that the apothecaries initially attributed to the accelerated development process. Some demonstrated enhanced strength or speed beyond normal parameters, their bodies having responded to the pure gene templates in ways that exceeded baseline expectations. Others showed improved healing rates or heightened sensory acuity. These variations were documented but not considered problematic. The Raptors remained within acceptable parameters for Space Marine physiology, and the enhanced capabilities were viewed as beneficial rather than concerning. Commander Agapito oversaw the integration of Raptors into existing formations, working to ensure that the new warriors bonded with the Legion's survivors and understood the traditions and combat doctrine that defined the Raven Guard. The veterans who had survived Istvan V initially viewed the Raptors with some skepticism. These warriors had not earned their place through the normal trials and had not proven themselves in combat. But the Raptors' eagerness to learn and their obvious dedication to the Legion's principles gradually won acceptance. Training exercises showed that the new warriors could fight effectively alongside veterans, and their fresh perspective sometimes identified tactical approaches that the traumatized survivors had not considered. The Alpha Legion's infiltration of the Raptor project occurred at a level so fundamental that its detection was nearly impossible. Traitor agents had penetrated Deliverance's security during the chaos following Istvan V, posing as refugees or support personnel who were absorbed into the fortress monastery's expanded operations. These infiltrators gained access to the gene forges and the genetic material that Corax had brought from Terra. They did not steal samples or sabotage equipment in obvious ways that would trigger security protocols. Instead, they introduced subtle corruptions into the genetic templates themselves, alterations so minor that standard screening procedures did not detect them. The corruption was designed to remain dormant through the early stages of transformation, allowing the initial generations of raptors to develop normally and demonstrate the project's success. Only after the implantation process was complete would the corrupted genetic code begin expressing itself, triggering mutations that would accelerate over time. The Alpha Legion's gene writes had calculated the progression carefully. The mutations would not become obvious until enough raptors had been created that the project's expansion was irreversible, ensuring maximum damage to the Raven Guard's reconstruction efforts. The first signs of problems appeared in raptors from the third generation of implantations. Warriors who had completed their transformation and joined active duty began experiencing physiological changes that fell outside normal parameters. Skin that should have been pale began developing scales or hardened plates. Bone structure shifted in ways that caused chronic pain and reduced mobility. Some raptors experienced uncontrolled muscle growth that distorted their frames and made armor fitting impossible. The apothecaries initially treated these as isolated incidents, possibly reactions to the stress of accelerated development or genetic incompatibilities in specific aspirants. The mutations accelerated rapidly once they began manifesting. Raptors who had shown only minor abnormalities deteriorated over days into creatures that barely resembled space marines. Their bodies twisted into forms that combined human and inhuman features in ways that violated every principle of the Emperor's genetic engineering. Some grew additional limbs or developed bestial features. Others experienced cognitive degradation that reduced them to animalistic intelligence despite their enhanced brains. The transformations were agonizing, with afflicted raptors suffering pain that even their enhanced physiology could not suppress. The scope of the contamination became clear as more raptors from later generations began showing symptoms. The corruption had spread through the entire genetic template stock, meaning that every raptor created after a certain point was potentially compromised. The apothecaries worked desperately to identify which genetic batches were corrupted and which remained pure, but the Alpha Legion's sabotage had been too thorough. Testing protocols that should have detected the alterations failed because the corruption existed at a level below what standard screening could identify. By the time the full extent of the problem was understood, hundreds of raptors were already showing signs of mutation. Corax's response to the crisis was immediate and brutal. The Primarch ordered all raptors showing any signs of mutation to be quarantined in secure facilities where they could be monitored and prevented from harming themselves or others. The gene forges were shut down completely, while the apothecaries conducted comprehensive analysis of the remaining genetic templates. New implantations ceased until the source of the corruption could be identified and eliminated. The Legion's reconstruction efforts ground to a halt as resources were redirected toward managing the disaster that the Raptor project had become. The quarantine facilities quickly proved inadequate as the mutations progressed. The afflicted raptors became increasingly unstable, their enhanced strength and resilience making them dangerous even in their deteriorated state. Some retained enough cognitive function to understand what was happening to them and begged for death rather than continued existence as monsters. Others had degraded beyond rational thought and attacked anyone who approached, driven by pain and instinct. The guards assigned to the facilities were themselves Raven Guard, forced to restrain and sometimes kill warriors who had been their brothers days or weeks earlier. Corax personally inspected the quarantine facilities and witnessed the full horror of what the corruption had produced. The creatures contained in the reinforced cells bore the black armor and pale skin of Raven Guard, but had been transformed into things that mocked everything the Legion represented. Some had grown to enormous size, their frames distorted by uncontrolled growth. Others had developed predatory features, claws, fangs, sensory organs that belonged to animals rather than humans. All of them were in constant agony, their bodies rejecting the mutations even as the corrupted genetic code forced the transformations to continue. The Primarch understood that these warriors could not be saved. The corruption was too fundamental, affecting them at the genetic level in ways that no medical intervention could reverse. Allowing them to continue existing in their current state was cruelty, and the risk that the mutations might spread to other Raven Guard through some mechanism the apothecaries had not identified was unacceptable. Corax made the decision that no commander should have to make. He would personally execute every corrupted raptor, taking responsibility for ending the lives of Jean's sons who had volunteered to serve the Legion and had been betrayed by the very process meant to transform them into warriors. The executions took place over the course of 3 days. Corax entered each cell alone, refusing to delegate this responsibility to anyone else. The Primarch killed his malformed sons with his remaining functional lightning claw, making the deaths as quick as the mutations allowed. Some of the corrupted raptors recognized him and understood what was happening, accepting their fate with what remained of their Space Marine discipline. Others fought back with the strength of madness and desperation, forcing Corax to battle creatures that had once been his Jean sons. The Primarch emerged from each cell covered in blood, his armor marked by the struggle, and proceeded immediately to the next without pause for rest or reflection. The final count of corrupted raptors exceeded 800 warriors. Nearly half of all the raptors created through the Accelerated Implantation Program had been compromised by the Alpha Legion's sabotage. The genetic templates that Corax had obtained from Terra were contaminated beyond recovery, their purity destroyed by alterations so subtle that they had evaded every security measure. The Raptor project was terminated completely, with all remaining genetic material destroyed and the specialized equipment dismantled. The Raven Guard's attempt to rebuild their strength through accelerated means had failed catastrophically, leaving them weaker than before the project began. The Raven Guard who emerged from the catastrophe of the Raptor project were fundamentally changed. The Legion had suffered 2 devastating blows in rapid succession, first the massacre at Istvan V, then the betrayal embedded within their own reconstruction efforts. The survivors numbered fewer than 4,000 battle brothers, a fraction of the strength they had possessed before the heresy began. Other legions that had remained loyal to the Emperor maintained forces, numbering in the tens of thousands, allowing them to prosecute campaigns across multiple sectors simultaneously. The Raven Guard could barely muster enough warriors for a single company-strength operation, and even those deployments risked further attrition that the Legion could not afford. Corax recognized that conventional warfare was no longer viable for his Legion. The 19th could not hold territory, could not engage in prolonged campaigns, and could not afford the casualties that came from direct confrontation with traitor forces. The tactical doctrine that had defined the Raven Guard during the Great Crusade, stealth, precision strikes, and rapid withdrawal, became not merely preferred methodology, but absolute necessity. The Legion would survive the heresy by returning to the principles that Corax had learned during the rebellion on Lycius, fighting a guerrilla war where every engagement was chosen carefully, and every objective served the broader strategy of bleeding the traitors while preserving loyalist strength. The first operations after the Raptor project's termination focused on intelligence gathering rather than direct combat. The Raven Guard needed to understand how the heresy was progressing across the galaxy, which systems had fallen to traitor control, and where loyalist forces were concentrated. This information would allow Corax to identify targets where small-scale raids could achieve disproportionate impact. The Legion's remaining Mordathan and specialized reconnaissance elements deployed across multiple sectors, operating independently for months at a time, while gathering data on traitor fleet movements, supply routes, and command structures. These reconnaissance missions revealed that Horus had established a sophisticated logistical network to support his rebellion. The War Master controlled forge worlds that produced weapons and ammunition, agricultural worlds that supplied food for his armies, and fuel depots that enabled his fleets to operate across vast distances. The Traitor Legions required the same material support as any military force, and the scale of the heresy meant that supply lines stretched across dozens of systems. These logistics networks represented vulnerabilities that conventional assaults could not effectively exploit. Destroying a single supply depot would accomplish little when dozens of others could compensate. But systematic disruption conducted over months could degrade the Traitor's operational capability in ways that direct military confrontation could not match. Corax developed a campaign strategy that prioritized these logistics targets over enemy combat forces. The Raven Guard would strike at supply convoys, sabotage manufacturing facilities, and eliminate the administrators and overseers who managed the Traitor's war economy. Each raid would be planned meticulously, with reconnaissance teams spending weeks studying the target before strike forces deployed. The actual attacks would last hours at most, with the Raven Guard hitting their objectives and withdrawing before enemy reinforcements could respond. The cumulative effect of dozens of such raids would force the Traitors to divert resources toward protecting their supply infrastructure, resources that could otherwise be used for offensive operations against loyalist strongholds. The raid on the Cruciate's fuel depot demonstrated this approach. The facility orbited a gas giant in a system that the Traitors used as a refueling point for fleets moving between major war zones. Reconnaissance elements had identified the depot's location and confirmed that it stored enough promethium and plasma fuel to supply an entire battle fleet for months. The facility's defenses were substantial, automated weapon platforms, a garrison of Traitor army troops, and periodic patrols by escort vessels. A conventional assault would require fleet assets that the Raven Guard did not possess, and would likely result in the depot's defenders destroying the fuel reserves rather than allowing them to be captured. The Raven Guard's approach bypassed these defenses entirely. A team of 30 more Dathan infiltrated the facility over the course of 2 weeks, arriving individually or in pairs aboard supply shuttles and commercial vessels that serviced the depot. The infiltrators posed as menial workers and maintenance personnel, their enhanced physiology concealed beneath layers of clothing, and their weapons smuggled in components that were assembled only after the entire team was in position. The more Dathan spent days mapping the facility's interior, identifying the locations of fuel storage tanks, control systems, and the quarters where the facility's command staff lived. The strike occurred during a shift change when the facility's corridors were crowded with workers moving between duty stations. The more Dathan emerged from their hiding places simultaneously, their silenced bolters and combat blades killing the facility's security personnel before alarms could be raised. The team split into smaller groups, each with specific objectives. One group seized the control center and locked down the facility's defensive systems, preventing the automated weapons from firing on the extraction craft that would arrive later. Another group planted demolition charges in the fuel storage areas, carefully calculating the placement to ensure complete destruction. A third group eliminated the facility's command staff, killing officers in their quarters before they could organize resistance or send distress signals. The entire operation from initial strike to extraction lasted 43 minutes. The Raven Guard withdrew aboard a captured cargo hauler that had been positioned nearby, departing the facility before Traitor patrol vessels could respond to the delayed distress calls that finally escaped the compromised communication systems. The demolition charges detonated 6 hours later, when the Raven Guard were safely distant, and the facility's surviving personnel had begun to believe they might salvage the situation. The explosions consumed the entire depot, the fuel reserves igniting in a fireball that was visible from the system's inner planets. The Traitor battle fleet that had been scheduled to refuel at Cruciate's had to divert to alternate facilities, delaying their deployment by weeks and disrupting the War Master's operational timeline for that sector. Similar raids occurred across the territories that Horus controlled. The Raven Guard struck at ammunition factories on Forge worlds, destroying production lines that manufactured bolter rounds and artillery shells. They sabotaged shipyards where trader vessels underwent repairs, planting explosives in critical structural supports that would cause catastrophic failures when the ships attempted to enter the warp. They assassinated logistics coordinators and supply officers, eliminating the individuals who managed the complex networks that kept trader armies equipped and fed. Each operation was small in scale, but carefully chosen to maximize disruption to the traders' war effort. The psychological impact of these raids extended beyond their immediate tactical results. Trader forces across multiple sectors found themselves unable to predict where the Raven Guard would strike next. Supply convoys required heavy escorts that reduced the efficiency of the logistics network. Manufacturing facilities diverted workers from production to security duties. Administrators and officers lived in constant fear of assassination, knowing that the Raven Guard could infiltrate even heavily defended installations. The traders began to see threats everywhere, their paranoia fed by the knowledge that an enemy who struck from shadows could be anyone, anywhere. Corax's personal focus during this period centered on hunting the word-bearers and their Primarch Lorgar. The 17th Legion had been among the 4 that betrayed the Loyalists at Istvan V, and Corax held them particularly responsible for the disaster. Intelligence gathered during reconnaissance operations suggested that Lorgar had orchestrated much of the heresy's ideological foundation, spreading the worship of chaos among the traitor legions and corrupting them with promises of power from the warp's malevolent entities. The word-bearers had also maintained close contact with the Alpha Legion, and Corax suspected they had played a role in the sabotage of the Raptor project, though he lacked concrete evidence. The hunt for Lorgar took the Raven Guard to systems where the word-bearers were prosecuting their own campaigns. Corax deployed reconnaissance teams to track the 17th Legion's movements and identify patterns in their operations. The word-bearers had shifted their focus from military conquest to spreading chaos worship among human populations, conducting rituals and establishing cults on worlds they conquered. This approach made them more predictable than other traitor legions. They remained in systems longer, building temples and indoctrinating populations rather than simply moving on after achieving compliance. The closest Corax came to confronting Lorgar directly occurred in the Norgoth system, where the word-bearers had established a major base of operations. Intelligence indicated that Lorgar himself was present on the primary world, overseeing the construction of a massive temple complex dedicated to the Chaos Gods. The Raven Guard deployed in force, committing nearly 1,000 warriors to an operation designed to decapitate the word-bearers' command structure. The plan called for simultaneous strikes against the temple complex and the orbital facilities where word-bearers' ships were docked, with Corax leading the ground assault personally while fleet elements engaged in orbit. The operation began well, with Raven Guard strike teams infiltrating the temple complex and eliminating the outer defenses. Corax fought his way through word-bearers' positions, his remaining lightning claw tearing through traitor space marines as he advanced toward the central chamber where intelligence suggested Lorgar would be conducting a ritual. The fighting was brutal, with the word-bearers defending their temple with fanatical determination. The Raven Guard's advantages in stealth and mobility were negated by the close confines and the enemy's willingness to die rather than retreat. Corax reached the central chamber to find it empty, except for word-bearers' corpses and the evidence of recently completed rituals. Lorgar had departed hours earlier, warned either by prescient visions granted by his Chaos patrons or by intelligence networks that had detected the Raven Guard's approach. The temple complex itself was a trap, rigged with explosives and warp-tainted devices that activated as the Raven Guard penetrated deeper. Corax ordered immediate withdrawal, recognizing that remaining in the complex risked catastrophic casualties for no strategic gain. The Raven Guard extracted under fire, losing over 100 warriors in the fighting and the subsequent retreat. The failure at Norgoth reinforced lessons that Corax had learned during the early heresy. The traitor legions were not the enemies he had faced during the Great Crusade. They possessed the same training and capabilities as loyalist space marines, and they had the advantage of chaos-granted powers that defied conventional military logic. Hunting Primarchs directly was beyond the Raven Guard's current capabilities. Such operations required resources and support that the Legion no longer possessed. Corax refocused his efforts on targets where the Raven Guard's strengths could be applied effectively, accepting that his personal vendetta against Lorgar would have to wait for circumstances that favored such confrontations. The coordination with other Loyalist forces presented both opportunities and challenges. The Raven Guard's guerrilla campaign was most effective when conducted independently, without the need to coordinate with larger Imperial formations, whose operational tempo and tactical doctrine differed substantially from the 19th Legion's approach. But complete isolation was neither practical nor strategically sound. The heresy would be won or lost based on the collective efforts of all Loyalist forces, and the Raven Guard needed to contribute to broader campaigns, even when doing so constrained their operational flexibility. The collaboration with Ultramarines' forces in the Thramas sector illustrated these tensions. Roboute Guilliman had established a secondary Imperium in Ultramar, maintaining Loyalist governance and military operations in regions that had been cut off from Terra by the Ruinstorm. The Ultramarines prosecuted campaigns with methodical precision, applying overwhelming force to liberate systems from traitor control, and then establishing robust defensive positions to prevent recapture. This approach achieved solid results, but required time and resources that the Raven Guard could not contribute meaningfully. Corax proposed an alternative arrangement where the Raven Guard would operate as an independent raiding force, striking at traitor positions in advance of Ultramarines' offensives to disrupt enemy preparations and eliminate key defensive assets. The Ultramarines would then exploit the chaos created by these raids to achieve rapid victories with reduced casualties. Guilliman accepted the proposal, recognizing that the Raven Guard's capabilities complemented rather than duplicated his own Legion's strengths. The coordination was loose by necessity. The Raven Guard operated on timelines measured in days or weeks, while Ultramarines' campaigns unfolded over months. But the arrangement allowed both legions to maximize their effectiveness within their respective operational frameworks. The psychological burden on the Raven Guard's survivors manifested in ways that Corax struggled to address. The warriors who had escaped Istvan V carried guilt that no amount of subsequent victories could erase. They had survived when tens of thousands of their brothers had died, and many questioned why they had been spared when warriors they considered better or more worthy had fallen. This survivor's guilt was compounded by the trauma of fighting former allies, of being betrayed by legions they had served alongside during the Great Crusade. The certainties that had defined their existence as Space Marines, the brotherhood of the Legion's Astartes, the inevitability of the Emperor's vision, had been shattered. The failed Raptor project added another layer of trauma. The warriors who had witnessed the mutations or had served as guards in the quarantine facilities carried memories of brothers transformed into monsters. Some had been forced to kill corrupted raptors who attacked them, fighting creatures that wore Raven Guard armor and bore the Legion's gene seed. The knowledge that the Alpha Legion had infiltrated Deliverance itself, that traitors had walked among them, and corrupted the very process meant to rebuild the Legion created paranoia that infected every aspect of Legion operations. Battle Brothers questioned whether their fellow warriors might be traitor agents, whether the orders they received came from legitimate commanders or infiltrators wearing stolen faces. Corax addressed these psychological wounds through a combination of practical action and philosophical reinforcement. He increased the operational tempo, keeping his warriors focused on immediate missions rather than allowing them time to dwell on past failures. The constant cycle of reconnaissance, planning, and execution left little opportunity for the kind of introspection that fed guilt and trauma. The Primarch also emphasized the principles that had guided the rebellion on Lycius, that they fought for liberation and justice, that every operation contributed to the eventual defeat of tyranny, that their brothers who had fallen would be honored through continued resistance rather than through paralysis and grief. The evolution of Legion culture during the heresy reflected these adaptations to trauma and reduced strength. The Raven Guard had always valued pragmatism over glory, but this tendency intensified as the war progressed. There was no room for heroic gestures or individual glory seeking when every warrior's survival mattered to the Legion's continued viability. The Battle Brothers learned to suppress their aggressive instincts even more thoroughly than before, to accept missions where they would gather intelligence without firing a shot, to withdraw from battles they could win if doing so preserved strength for more critical operations. The relationship between Terran veterans and Deliverance-born Raven Guard shifted as the heresy continued. The distinctions that had once mattered, who had served before Corax's arrival, who had fought in the rebellion, became less relevant when measured against the shared experience of Istvan V and its aftermath. The survivors were united by trauma and by the understanding that they were among the last of their kind. New recruits joined the Legion through conventional means, the accelerated implantation procedures abandoned permanently after the Raptor project's failure. These new warriors were inducted into a Legion that had been broken and rebuilt, that carried scars, both physical and psychological, that would never fully heal. The Raven Guard's operations during the middle years of the heresy established patterns that would define the Legion for millennia. They became specialists in void warfare conducted through boarding actions and ship seizures, their experience from the Great Crusade refined through constant practice against traitor vessels. They perfected the art of strategic raiding, identifying targets whose destruction would cascade through enemy logistics networks. They developed intelligence-gathering capabilities that rivaled the Alpha Legions, though without the traitors' willingness to employ infiltrators who might spend years establishing cover identities. The toll of this constant warfare was measured not just in casualties, but in the incremental degradation of equipment and resources. The Raven Guard's ships required maintenance that could not be performed adequately with reduced crew complements and limited access to Forge World facilities. Power armor accumulated damage that field repairs could not fully address, with Battle Brothers wearing ceramite plate that bore the scars of dozens of engagements. Weapons that should have been replaced after years of service remained in use because the Legion lacked the production capacity to manufacture new ones. The Raven Guard were fighting a war of attrition where every loss of warriors, equipment, or ships could not be fully replaced. Corax himself bore the weight of command in ways that isolated him from his Gene sons. The Primarch had always been more reserved than some of his brothers, more comfortable with solitude than with the camaraderie that defined other legions. The heresy intensified this tendency, as the decisions he made daily involved calculations of acceptable losses and strategic priorities that left no room for sentiment. He sent warriors on missions knowing that some would not return, accepted casualties in operations that achieved their objectives, and maintained the operational tempo even when his legion desperately needed rest and recovery. The burden of these choices marked him visibly. The Primarch who had once fought for liberation now commanded a legion engaged in a grinding war of survival, where victory meant merely continuing to fight another day. The final years of the heresy saw the Raven Guard's operational capacity stretched to its absolute limits. The Legion maintained a presence across multiple war zones, conducting raids and reconnaissance operations that required their forces to be dispersed in ways that would have been tactically unsound for any other Space Marine formation. Individual companies operated independently for months, sometimes losing contact with Legion command entirely as warp storms and traitor interdiction made communication increasingly unreliable. The warriors adapted to this isolation, making strategic decisions based on their understanding of Corax's intent, rather than waiting for explicit orders that might never arrive. The Siege of Terra represented the culmination of everything the heresy had been building toward. Horus brought his full strength to bear against humanity's birthworld, deploying 8 traitor legions and countless army regiments in an assault designed to break the Imperial Palace's defenses and kill the Emperor. The Loyalist forces that gathered to defend Terra included the Imperial Fists, Blood Angels, and White Scars, along with elements of other legions that had managed to reach the throne world before the siege began. The Raven Guard's contribution to this defense was necessarily limited by their depleted numbers and the strategic commitments they maintained elsewhere. Corax deployed approximately 800 warriors to Terra, roughly a quarter of the Legion's remaining strength. These forces did not participate in the defense of the Imperial Palace itself, where Rogel Dorn had established defensive positions that required massive concentrations of troops to hold against the traitor assault. Instead, the Raven Guard operated in the outer system, conducting void warfare operations against traitor supply lines and reinforcement fleets attempting to reach the siege. The 19th Legion's ships prowled the approaches to Terra, identifying isolated traitor vessels or small convoy groups that could be attacked without drawing overwhelming response. These operations followed the patterns the Raven Guard had perfected during their guerrilla campaign. Strike teams would board traitor vessels, seize control of critical systems, and either capture the ships intact or sabotage them beyond repair. Supply convoys found their escorts eliminated, and their cargo vessels boarded by warriors who emerged from the darkness of space without warning. The Raven Guard could not prevent the traitor forces from reaching Terra. The scale of Horus's invasion fleet made that impossible, but they could attrite the enemy's strength and disrupt their logistics in ways that complicated the siege operations. The void warfare during the siege of Terra differed substantially from the ship-to-ship combat the Raven Guard had conducted during the Great Crusade. The traitor vessels were crewed by warriors who had fought alongside the Raven Guard for decades, who knew their tactics and had developed countermeasures. The Alpha Legion in particular seemed to anticipate Raven Guard movements, positioning their ships to intercept boarding attempts or laying ambushes along approach vectors that should have been secure. The fighting in the cramped corridors of warships became even more brutal as both sides understood that quarter would neither be asked nor given. Commander Bran led the Void operations, coordinating multiple strike forces from his flagship while maintaining awareness of the broader tactical situation. The Terran veteran had spent his entire service life in ship-to-ship combat, and his understanding of Void warfare tactics was unmatched within the Legion. Bran identified patterns in traitor fleet movements that allowed the Raven Guard to position themselves advantageously, striking at vessels that had separated from their main formations or intercepting reinforcement groups before they could join the siege. His leadership ensured that the Raven Guard's limited numbers achieved impact disproportionate to their strength. The siege itself lasted for weeks, with the fighting on Terra's surface reaching levels of intensity that surpassed anything the Imperium had witnessed. The traitor legions breached the outer defenses and fought their way toward the Imperial Palace, grinding through defensive positions that Dorn had spent years fortifying. The casualties on both sides mounted into the hundreds of thousands as Space Marines who had once been brothers killed each other in the ruins of humanity's birthworld. The Raven Guard in the outer system received fragmentary reports of the ground fighting, understanding that the siege's outcome would determine whether their guerrilla campaign had any meaning or whether the Imperium would fall regardless of their efforts. The War Master's death came not through military defeat, but through single combat with the Emperor aboard Horus's flagship. The details of that confrontation remained unclear to most of the Imperium's forces, but the result was undeniable. Horus was dead, killed by the Emperor's hand, and the traitor assault on Terra collapsed as their leadership fragmented. The Emperor himself had been mortally wounded in the confrontation, his body broken in ways that even his immense power could not heal. The Imperium had survived, but at a cost that would reshape everything about how humanity's interstellar empire functioned. The immediate aftermath of the siege saw the traitor legions withdrawing from the Sol system in disorder. The forces that had been united under Horus's command fractured as individual Primarchs pursued their own agendas. Some traitor legions fled toward the Eye of Terror, the massive warp rift that had expanded during the heresy and now offered sanctuary to those who served chaos. Others scattered across the galaxy, seeking refuge in systems they controlled or attempting to establish their own domains independent of Imperial authority. The withdrawal was not an organized retreat, but a rout, with traitor forces abandoning equipment and supplies in their haste to escape before loyalist reinforcements could trap them in the Sol system. The Raven Guard pursued the fleeing traitors with single-minded determination. Corax ordered his forces to track the word-bearers specifically, his hatred of Lorgar, and the 17th Legion undiminished by the years of grinding warfare. The Raven Guard ships that had operated in Saul's outer system during the siege redeployed immediately, following word-bearers' vessels as they fled toward the galactic east. The pursuit took the Raven Guard across sectors that had been devastated by the heresy, through systems where human populations had been slaughtered or corrupted by chaos worship, past worlds that had been virus-bombed or subjected to exterminatus by both loyalist and traitor forces. The hunt for the word-bearers became Corax's consuming focus. The Primarch led from the front, his flagship maintaining contact with word-bearers' fleet elements even as they attempted to break pursuit through warp jumps and evasive maneuvers. The Raven Guard conducted boarding actions against isolated word-bearers' vessels, killing their crews and interrogating survivors for information about Lorgar's location. Each engagement brought them closer to their target, though the word-bearers fought with desperate ferocity, knowing that capture or defeat meant death at the hands of warriors who would show no mercy. The final pursuit led the Raven Guard to the Eye of Terror itself. The word-bearers had retreated into the Warp Rift, seeking sanctuary in a realm where the laws of reality no longer applied and where chaos held absolute dominion. For most Imperial forces, entering the Eye of Terror would have been suicide. The warp energies that saturated the region drove mortals insane and corrupted even space marines who lingered too long. Corax understood these dangers but refused to abandon his hunt. The word-bearers had been instrumental in the heresy's beginning, had corrupted other legions with their chaos worship, and had betrayed the loyalists at Istvan V. The Primarch would not allow them to escape justice simply because they had fled to a place where conventional military forces could not follow. The scene aboard the Raven Guard flagship before Corax's departure was subdued. The Primarch gathered his remaining commanders and explained his intention to pursue the word-bearers into the Eye of Terror. He made clear that this was a mission he would undertake alone. Bringing the Legion into the Warp Rift would accomplish nothing except their corruption and destruction. The Raven Guard had fought throughout the heresy to preserve the Emperor's vision, and they would continue that fight in the campaigns that would follow. But Corax's personal vendetta against Lorgar had become something separate from the Legion's broader purpose, a hunt that required him to venture into places where his Gene sons could not follow. Commander Agapito protested the decision, arguing that the Legion needed its Primarch to lead them through the reconstruction that would follow the heresy. The Raven Guard had been broken and rebuilt once already, and they would need Corax's guidance to recover from the additional losses suffered during the siege and the subsequent pursuit. Agapito pointed out that hunting Lorgar into the Eye of Terror was likely suicide, that even a Primarch could not survive indefinitely in a realm of pure chaos, and that the Legion could not afford to lose their father after everything they had already sacrificed. Corax's response acknowledged these concerns, but did not alter his decision. He explained that the Raven Guard had proven they could function without his direct leadership. They had conducted independent operations throughout the heresy, making strategic decisions based on their understanding of his doctrine rather than waiting for explicit orders. The Legion's strength had never derived from his personal presence, but from the principles he had instilled in them, the understanding of how to fight from shadows and strike with precision. Those principles would guide the Raven Guard through whatever challenges they faced, whether he returned from the Eye of Terror or not. The Primarch's final words to his Legion emphasized continuity rather than departure. He reminded them that they fought for liberation and justice, that every operation should serve those principles regardless of the tactical situation. He instructed them to rebuild their strength through conventional recruitment, to avoid the shortcuts that had led to the Raptor Project's disaster, and to maintain the standards that had defined the Raven Guard since the rebellion on Deliverance. He expressed pride in what they had accomplished during the heresy, noting that the Legion had survived when other formations had been destroyed completely, and that their guerrilla campaign had contributed meaningfully to the Emperor's victory despite their limited numbers. Corax departed alone aboard a small vessel stripped of all unnecessary equipment and supplies. The ship's machine spirit had been consecrated by Mechanicum priests and warded with protective sigils, though whether such measures would provide any defense against the Eye of Terror's corrupting influence remained uncertain. The Raven Guard watched from their flagship as the Primarch's vessel entered the warp rift, its hull illuminated briefly by the kaleidoscopic energies that churned within the eye before disappearing completely. No communication followed, no signal indicating whether Corax had survived the transition or been consumed immediately by the forces that dwelt within. The Raven Guard remained at the Eye of Terror's edge for weeks, maintaining position in case their Primarch returned or sent word of his progress. The waiting was difficult for warriors who had spent years in constant action, and the proximity to the warp rift created psychological pressure that affected even space marines. Some battle brothers reported dreams of their Primarch fighting in impossible landscapes where physics held no meaning, battling demon creatures that wore the faces of word-bearers. Others experienced visions of Corax transformed into something inhuman, his body warped by chaos energies until he resembled the corrupted raptors he had been forced to execute. The Legion's librarians worked to suppress these visions, understanding them as manifestations of the Eye's influence rather than genuine precognition. Commander Bran eventually ordered the withdrawal from the Eye of Terror's vicinity. The Raven Guard could not remain indefinitely waiting for a Primarch who might never return, and their presence was needed elsewhere as the Imperium began organizing the campaigns that would become known as the Great Scouring. The Legion departed the region with the understanding that Corax's fate would likely remain unknown, that their father had ventured into a realm from which return was improbable at best. The loss was profound but not paralyzing. The Raven Guard had learned during the Heresy how to function despite catastrophic setbacks, and they would adapt to this absence as they had adapted to everything else the war had demanded of them. The Great Scouring represented the Imperium's response to the traitor forces that had scattered after Horus's death. Loyalist legions pursued the fleeing traitors across the galaxy, hunting them to their strongholds and eliminating them wherever they attempted to establish new bases of operations. The campaign was less coordinated than the Great Crusade had been. There was no War Master to direct overall strategy, and individual legions operated with substantial independence based on their own intelligence and priorities. The Raven Guard participated in this pursuit despite their depleted strength, applying the same guerrilla tactics they had perfected during the Heresy to operations designed to eliminate traitor remnants. The Legion's approach to the Scouring differed from other Loyalist forces in predictable ways, where formations like the Imperial Fists or Ultramarines conducted systematic campaigns to liberate entire sectors. The Raven Guard focused on eliminating specific high-value targets. They hunted traitor commanders who had escaped the siege of Terra, assassinating them before they could rally their forces or establish new strongholds. They destroyed supply caches and equipment stockpiles that traitor forces had hidden, denying the enemy resources they would need to sustain prolonged resistance. They conducted reconnaissance operations that identified traitor positions for other Loyalist forces to assault, providing intelligence that enabled more effective campaigns by legions with greater numerical strength. The pursuit of Alpha Legion forces became a particular focus for the Raven Guard. The 20th Legion had been instrumental in the betrayal at Istvan V and had sabotaged the Raptor project, making them targets of special hatred for Corax's Gene Sons. The Alpha Legion's operational methods made them difficult to track. They used false identities, operated through proxy forces, and maintained cells that functioned independently without clear connection to central command. The Raven Guard applied similar methods in reverse, infiltrating suspected Alpha Legion operations and working to identify the true traitors hidden among what appeared to be legitimate Imperial forces. These counter-infiltration operations required the Raven Guard to develop capabilities they had not emphasized previously. The Legion's librarians learned to detect the subtle psychic signatures that Alpha Legion operatives sometimes carried, identifying traitors through methods that conventional intelligence gathering could not match. Interrogators developed techniques for breaking Alpha Legion conditioning, extracting information from captured operatives who had been trained to resist standard questioning. The Raven Guard established networks of informants and agents across multiple sectors, creating an intelligence apparatus that could track the Alpha Legion's movements and identify their operations before they achieved their objectives. The second founding occurred as the Imperium reorganized its military forces in the Scouring's aftermath. The Codex Astartes, written by Robute Guilliman, mandated that the original Space Marine legions be broken into smaller chapters of approximately 1,000 warriors each. This reorganization was intended to prevent any single commander from wielding the kind of power that had enabled Horus's rebellion, distributing military strength across multiple independent formations that could not be corrupted or turned against the Imperium as easily as the legions had been. The Raven Guard's depleted state meant they had fewer successor chapters than most legions, but several formations were created from their remaining gene seed stock. The Black Guard were established as a fleet-based chapter that would continue the Raven Guard's void warfare traditions. These warriors specialized in boarding actions and ship seizures, maintaining the expertise that Terran veterans like Bran had developed over decades of campaigning. The Black Guard received the Legion's most experienced void warfare specialists as their initial cadre, ensuring that the knowledge accumulated during the heresy would be preserved and passed to future generations. Their operational doctrine emphasized the rapid seizure of enemy vessels through surgical boarding actions, capturing ships intact when possible, rather than destroying them through conventional naval engagement. The Revilers were founded with a focus on the most brutal aspects of close-quarters combat. These warriors inherited the Raven Guard's preference for striking from shadows, but combined it with an aggression that bordered on the savage. The Revilers' combat doctrine emphasized the psychological impact of sudden, overwhelming violence. They would infiltrate enemy positions silently, then attack with such ferocity that survivors would be traumatized beyond their ability to fight effectively. The chapter's reputation for brutality created tensions with other Imperial forces, but their effectiveness in eliminating entrenched enemies made them valuable assets for campaigns where conventional assault tactics had failed. The Raptors represented an attempt to preserve the lessons learned from both the successful aspects of Raven Guard doctrine and the failed Raptor project. The chapter's name deliberately invoked the Accelerated Development Program, acknowledging both its initial promise and its catastrophic failure. The Raptors emphasized adaptability and practical innovation, encouraging their warriors to modify standard equipment and develop new tactics based on the specific challenges they encountered. The chapter became known for fielding warriors whose armor and weapons showed extensive customization, with individual battle brothers making modifications that reflected their personal combat experience and preferences. Each successor chapter inherited the Raven Guard's gene seed flaws along with their combat doctrine. The pale skin and black eyes that marked Corax's gene sons appeared in all the successor chapters, visual reminders of their lineage. The higher rejection rates during implantation meant that these chapters struggled to maintain their strength through normal recruitment, requiring them to be more selective about aspirants and accepting that their numbers would likely remain below the Codex prescribed 1,000 warriors. The chapters adapted to this limitation by emphasizing quality over quantity, ensuring that every battle brother received extensive training and could operate independently when necessary. The Raven Guard themselves retained their name and their role as the primary inheritors of Corax's legacy. The chapter maintained Deliverance as their home world and continued recruiting from the moon's population, preserving the connection to the rebellion that had shaped their Primarch's philosophy. The fortress monastery was rebuilt and expanded, incorporating lessons learned during the heresy about security and the need to prevent infiltration. The gene laboratories where the Raptor project had been conducted were sealed permanently, their equipment destroyed, and their chambers consecrated to ensure that no future attempt would be made to replicate the accelerated implantation procedures. The transition from Legion to Chapter required adjustments to command structure and operational doctrine. The Raven Guard's dispersed operations during the heresy had prepared them well for functioning as a smaller formation, but the reduction in overall strength meant that some capabilities had to be abandoned entirely. The specialized formations, like the Mordathan, could not be maintained at their previous scale when the entire chapter numbered only 1,000 warriors. Instead, these capabilities were distributed across the chapter, with individual companies maintaining squads trained in advanced stealth techniques, rather than concentrating all such specialists in dedicated formations. The Raven Guard, who entered the 41st millennium, bore little resemblance to the legion that had fought during the Great Crusade. 10,000 years of warfare had refined their doctrine, while simultaneously forcing compromises that Corax might not have recognized. The chapter maintained approximately 1,000 battle brothers at any given time, though this number fluctuated based on recruitment success and combat losses. The gene seed degradation that had begun during the heresy continued to manifest in every generation, with the Mucranoid and Becher's gland showing no function in any Raven Guard space marine. The Mucranoid, which should have secreted a waxy substance to protect against extreme temperatures and vacuum exposure, remained completely inert. The Becher's gland, designed to produce poisonous saliva that could be used as a weapon or to digest otherwise inedible materials, similarly failed to develop properly during the implantation process. These missing organs created practical limitations that affected combat operations. Raven Guard warriors required full environmental sealing in their armor when operating in vacuum or extreme temperature environments, unable to rely on the biological protections that other chapters possessed. The lack of the Becher's gland meant they could not employ the acid spit attacks that some space marines used in close combat, and they required standard rations rather than being able to consume a wider variety of organic materials in survival situations. The chapter's apothecaries had spent millennia attempting to correct these deficiencies, but the genetic damage appeared to be permanent, possibly linked to whatever corruption the Emperor had warned Corax about when providing the pure gene templates. The physical phenotype remained consistent across all Raven Guard: pale skin that resembled corpse flesh and eyes that were entirely black, the iris and pupil indistinguishable from each other. These features appeared regardless of the aspirant's original ethnic background or the environmental conditions on their recruitment world. A recruit from a desert world where the population had dark skin would emerge from the transformation process with the same pallor as someone recruited from Deliverance itself. The black eyes were particularly distinctive, giving Raven Guard warriors an unsettling appearance that some Imperial citizens found disturbing. The chapter had long since stopped attempting to explain or justify these features, accepting them as marks of their lineage and proof of their connection to their absent Primarch. Recruitment challenges stemmed from both the gene seed flaws and the stringent selection criteria the chapter maintained. The Raven Guard could not afford to waste gene seed on aspirants who would reject the implants, so they developed extensive testing procedures to identify candidates with the highest probability of successful transformation. These tests evaluated physical resilience, psychological stability, and genetic compatibility in ways that went beyond what most chapters required. The result was a recruitment process that accepted perhaps 1 in every 20 candidates who volunteered, with many of those accepted still failing to survive the implantation process. The chapter maintained recruitment rights on multiple worlds beyond Deliverance, establishing relationships with planetary governors who would identify suitable candidates and send them to the Raven Guard for evaluation. Deliverance itself had evolved substantially from the prison moon that Corax had liberated. The population numbered in the millions, descended from the original freed slaves and subsequent generations who had built lives in the tunnels and surface settlements. The Lycian mining tradition continued, though now the work was performed by free citizens rather than prisoners, and the resources extracted served the chapter's needs rather than enriching distant tech guilds. The mines produced rare minerals and metals that the Raven Guard's tech marines used to manufacture specialized equipment, and the deep tunnel networks served as training grounds where aspirants learned the same skills that had defined the rebellion millennia earlier. The fortress monastery known as Ravenspire dominated the moon's largest surface settlement. The structure had been built into a mountain range, its architecture combining defensive pragmatism with the aesthetic that reflected the chapter's identity. Black stone and dark metal formed walls that rose hundreds of meters, punctuated by narrow windows that resembled the eye slits in a helmet. Gargoyles carved to resemble ravens perched on every corner and buttress, their stone beaks open as if calling warnings. The fortress contained everything the chapter required to function independently: armories, training halls, gene laboratories, vehicle bays, and the chambers where the chapter's leadership conducted their planning. The Raven Spire's deepest levels housed the chapter's most sacred spaces. The Hall of Remembrance contained the names of every Raven Guard who had died since the Legion's founding, carved into black marble walls that stretched for kilometers. The chamber was maintained in absolute silence, with battle brothers visiting to honor fallen comrades and reflect on the chapter's history. The gene vault stored the precious gene seed stocks that represented the chapter's future, each sample carefully preserved and monitored by apothecaries who understood that any contamination or loss could not be easily replaced. The Reclusiam served as the spiritual center, where chaplains led the chapter in ceremonies that reinforced their identity and purpose, reminding them of Corax's teachings and the principles that should guide their actions. The chapter's organization followed the Codex Astartes in broad structure, while maintaining variations that reflected their operational requirements. The Raven Guard fielded 10 companies, each nominally containing 100 warriors, though actual strength varied based on casualties and recruitment success. The first company consisted of veterans who had proven themselves through decades of service, warriors who wore Terminator armor or other specialized equipment and deployed on the most dangerous missions. Companies 2 through 5 were battle companies, maintaining a mix of tactical, assault, and devastator squads that allowed them to function independently across various combat environments. Companies 6 through 9 were reserve companies that provided reinforcements and specialized capabilities, with some focusing on specific combat roles like close assault or fire support. The 10th company contained scouts, aspirants who had survived the initial implantation process and were undergoing the final stages of their transformation into full battle brothers. The command structure emphasized decentralized decision-making in ways that would have been familiar to the Legion's Terran veterans. Company captains possessed substantial autonomy in how they prosecuted their assigned missions, with chapter master oversight focused on strategic coordination rather than tactical micromanagement. This approach reflected the reality that Raven Guard forces often operated dispersed across multiple war zones, with individual companies deploying to different sectors and maintaining independent operations for months or years. The captains were selected not just for their combat prowess, but for their ability to make sound strategic decisions without waiting for orders from higher command, understanding the chapter's doctrine well enough to apply it effectively in situations that Corax himself could not have anticipated. The specialized command positions within the chapter reflected capabilities developed over millennia of warfare. The Master of Shadows oversaw the chapter's intelligence operations, coordinating reconnaissance missions, and managing the networks of informants and agents that the Raven Guard maintained across Imperial space. This position required skills that went beyond military intelligence gathering, encompassing the kind of counter-infiltration work that had become necessary after the Alpha Legion's betrayal. The Master of the Arsenal commanded the chapter's tech marines and maintained relationships with Forge Worlds that supplied equipment and performed repairs beyond the chapter's organic capabilities. The position demanded both technical expertise and political acumen, as securing priority access to Mechanicum resources required navigating the Adeptus Mechanicus's internal politics. The chapter's librarius maintained smaller numbers than many other chapters due to the same gene seed issues that affected overall recruitment. Raven Guard librarians specialized in abilities that complemented the chapter's operational methods: divination to identify enemy positions and predict their movements, telepathy to coordinate forces operating under communications blackout, and psychic stealth techniques that could conceal entire squads from enemy detection. The librarians worked closely with reconnaissance elements, providing capabilities that enhanced intelligence gathering beyond what physical infiltration could achieve. Their training emphasized restraint and precision in psychic power application, understanding that excessive warp manipulation could alert enemies to their presence or attract unwanted attention from entities that dwelt in the Imperium. The Reclusiam's chaplains served as the chapter's spiritual guides and enforcers of discipline. These warriors maintained the traditions that connected the current Raven Guard to their founding, ensuring that new generations understood the principles Corax had established and the sacrifices that previous battle brothers had made. The chaplains led the chapter in rituals that honored the Emperor and the Primarch, though their approach was notably less ostentatious than some chapters practiced. Raven Guard ceremonies emphasized quiet reflection and personal commitment rather than grand displays, reflecting the chapter's preference for substance over spectacle. The chaplains also served as counselors for warriors struggling with the psychological burdens that came from the chapter's style of warfare, understanding that operating in isolation and conducting missions where success meant remaining undetected could create mental strain that required careful management. The Apothecarium faced unique challenges in maintaining the chapter's gene seed stocks and managing the implantation process. Every gene seed sample was precious given the rejection rates and the missing organs that affected all Raven Guard. The apothecaries maintained detailed genetic records on every battle brother, tracking any variations or mutations that might indicate further degradation. They worked constantly to refine the implantation procedures, attempting to improve success rates while maintaining the standards that ensured only suitable candidates received the gene seed. The apothecaries also bore responsibility for harvesting progenitor glands from fallen battle brothers, a duty that took on special significance given the chapter's numerical constraints. Every recovered gene seed sample represented the potential for a future warrior, making the apothecary's role in battlefield recovery operations critical to the chapter's long-term survival. The chapter's relationship with the Codex Astartes reflected pragmatic adaptation rather than rigid adherence. The Raven Guard followed the Codex's organizational principles and tactical doctrines where they made sense, but they maintained variations based on their specific capabilities and operational requirements. The emphasis on stealth and infiltration meant that standard Codex tactics for frontal assault or defensive operations received less training time than specialized techniques for covert insertion and rapid strike missions. The chapter's vehicle complement skewed toward fast-moving platforms like land speeders and aircraft rather than heavy armor, reflecting their preference for mobility over sustained firepower. The Devastator squads that other chapters used for fire support were present but employed differently, often deploying in concealed positions where they could provide covering fire for infiltration teams rather than anchoring defensive lines. The training regime for new scouts emphasized the skills that had defined the Raven Guard since Corax's time. Aspirants learned to move through various terrains without leaving traces, to remain motionless for extended periods while observing enemy positions, and to identify critical vulnerabilities in fortifications and equipment. They practiced with sniper rifles and other precision weapons, developing marksmanship skills that would allow them to eliminate high-value targets from extreme ranges. The training took place in Deliverance's tunnel networks and in specially constructed facilities that replicated various combat environments, from urban ruins to wilderness areas to void ship interiors. The scouts who survived this training and earned promotion to full battle brother status possessed capabilities that exceeded what most chapters expected from their reconnaissance elements. The chapter's combat doctrine in the 41st millennium maintained the fundamental principles that Corax had established while adapting to threats that did not exist during the Heresy. The Raven Guard still emphasized stealth, precision strikes, and rapid withdrawal, but they applied these principles against enemies like the Tyranids, whose biological sensors could detect concealed warriors through methods that defeated conventional stealth techniques. They fought orcs whose crude technology and chaotic organization required different approaches than the systematic warfare they had perfected against human opponents. They engaged Chaos forces, whose warp-enhanced abilities and demonic allies defied the tactical logic that governed conventional military operations. Each enemy type required adaptation of basic principles, with the chapter's warriors learning to apply their core doctrine in ways that accounted for specific enemy capabilities. The Badab War demonstrated how the Raven Guard prosecuted campaigns in the 41st millennium. The conflict began when Luft-Huron, chapter master of the Astral Claws, declared independence from the Imperium and established his own domain in the Badab sector. Several other chapters joined Huron's rebellion, creating a regional conflict that required Imperial intervention. The Raven Guard deployed elements of 3 companies to participate in the Loyalist response, operating alongside chapters like the Marines Errant and Fire Hawks. The Raven Guard's role focused on reconnaissance and targeted strikes against the secessionist forces' command structure and logistics network. The campaign lasted years, with the Raven Guard conducting operations that exemplified their doctrine. They infiltrated Badab Primaris, the heavily fortified world that served as Huron's capital, gathering intelligence on defensive positions and identifying vulnerabilities that other Loyalist forces could exploit. They conducted assassination missions against secessionist commanders, eliminating officers whose leadership was critical to coordinating the rebel defense. They sabotaged supply depots and ammunition stockpiles, degrading the secessionists' ability to sustain prolonged resistance. The Raven Guard avoided the kind of direct assaults that other chapters conducted, understanding that their limited numbers made such operations prohibitively costly. Instead, they focused on enabling other Loyalist forces to achieve victory through the intelligence and disruption they provided. The defense against Snagrod represented a different type of challenge. The Orc warlord Snagrod had united multiple tribes and launched a massive invasion of Imperial space, threatening Forge worlds and Hive worlds across several sectors. The Crimson Fists bore the brunt of the initial assault and suffered catastrophic losses when their fortress monastery was destroyed. The Raven Guard deployed to support the Crimson Fists and other chapters fighting to contain the Orc invasion, conducting operations that targeted the WAAGH's logistics and command structure. Orcs presented unique challenges for stealth-based warfare. Their crude technology was often immune to the kind of sabotage that worked against more sophisticated enemies, and their tribal organization meant that eliminating individual leaders did not necessarily disrupt their overall coordination. The Raven Guard adapted by focusing on targets where their capabilities could achieve meaningful impact. They struck at Orc supply convoys, destroying the looted vehicles and captured equipment that the Xenos used to sustain their advance. They eliminated mechboys whose technical expertise was critical for maintaining the Orcs' war machines, targeting these specialists with sniper fire or close-range assassination before the Orcs could protect them adequately. They conducted raids on Orc encampments during the night cycles when even Orcs slept, killing sentries and planting explosives that would detonate hours later when the camps were fully occupied. These operations could not stop the WAAGH entirely, but they slowed its momentum and bought time for Imperial forces to organize more substantial resistance. The chapter's operations across the Imperium in the 41st millennium took them to war zones that would have been unimaginable during the Great Crusade. They fought in the Damocles Gulf against Tau expansion, conducting reconnaissance that identified fire caste positions and targeting ethereal caste leaders whose death disrupted Tau command structure. They deployed to the Armageddon war zone during the Third War for Armageddon, operating behind Orc lines to gather intelligence on Gozkul Thraka's forces and eliminate key warbosses. They participated in the defense of Cadia during the 13th Black Crusade, conducting void warfare operations against Chaos fleets and boarding actions that seized trader vessels before they could deploy ground forces. The chapter maintained relationships with other Imperial organizations that supported their operational requirements. The Officio Assassinorum provided specialized assets for missions where even Raven Guard capabilities proved insufficient, with Vindicare snipers or Culexus assassins deploying alongside chapter forces on particularly critical operations. The Inquisition occasionally requested Raven Guard support for investigations that required military force combined with stealth capabilities, though the chapter maintained careful boundaries around these relationships to avoid being drawn into inquisitorial politics. The Imperial Navy coordinated with the chapter's fleet elements, providing transportation and fire support for operations where the Raven Guard's own naval assets were insufficient. The chapter's fleet consisted of vessels optimized for rapid deployment and void warfare rather than sustained fleet engagements. The strike cruisers that served as the primary capital ships were faster than standard Space Marine vessels, their engines modified to provide acceleration that allowed them to close with enemy ships quickly or disengage when facing superior forces. The fleet included numerous rapid strike vessels and boarding craft, reflecting the chapter's emphasis on ship-to-ship combat conducted through boarding actions rather than long-range gunnery duels. The Tech Marines who maintained these vessels had developed expertise in void warfare systems that exceeded what most chapters required, understanding that the fleet's operational readiness directly impacted the chapter's ability to project force across the distances that separated war zones. The gene seed tithes that the Raven Guard provided to the Adeptus Mechanicus on Mars represented a constant concern. The chapter was required to send a portion of their gene seed stocks to Mars for testing and potential use in founding new chapters, but the degraded nature of Raven Guard gene seed made this obligation particularly burdensome. Every sample sent to Mars was one that could not be used to create a new Raven Guard warrior, and the chapter's limited recruitment success meant they could not easily spare the gene seed. The Mechanicus had attempted to use Raven Guard gene seed to found new chapters on several occasions, with mixed results. Some successor chapters maintained stable gene seed and functioned effectively, while others experienced the same degradation issues as their progenitors or worse, requiring additional oversight and support. The chapter's current strength in the 41st millennium fluctuated between 800 and 1,000 warriors, depending on recent casualties and recruitment success. This number represented a continuous struggle to maintain operational capability while managing the limitations imposed by gene seed degradation and high rejection rates. The chapter master and his command staff maintained careful projections of future strength based on current recruitment pipelines and expected casualty rates from ongoing operations, making strategic decisions about deployment and force allocation based on these projections. The reality was that the Raven Guard could not fight the same way that chapters with more stable gene seed and higher numbers could, requiring them to be selective about which conflicts they engaged in and how they allocated their limited forces. The Raven Guard's cultural identity in the 41st millennium remains defined by principles that Corax established during the liberation of Deliverance 10,000 years earlier. The chapter's emphasis on freedom as a fundamental value shapes how they interact with Imperial citizens and how they view their role within the Imperium's military structure. Unlike some chapters that maintain distance from the populations they defend, viewing civilians as resources to be protected but not necessarily understood, the Raven Guard remember that their Primarch was raised among slaves and led a rebellion against tyranny. This historical foundation creates a chapter culture where individual liberty and resistance to oppression are not abstract concepts but core beliefs that inform operational decisions. The hatred of tyrants and slavers manifests in how the chapter prioritizes targets and allocates resources. When presented with multiple potential deployments, the Raven Guard consistently favor operations against enemies who enslave human populations or establish tyrannical control over Imperial worlds. The chapter has conducted numerous campaigns against Dark Eldar raiding parties, recognizing that the Xenos slavers represent exactly the kind of evil that Corax fought against on Lycius. These operations often receive priority, even when other threats might pose greater strategic danger to the Imperium, reflecting the chapter's willingness to let their cultural values influence military decision-making in ways that purely pragmatic commanders might question. This philosophical stance creates occasional friction with other imperial organizations. The Adeptus Administratum sometimes requests Raven Guard support for compliance actions against rebellious worlds, only to find the chapter reluctant to deploy if the rebellion appears to be a legitimate uprising against corrupt imperial governors rather than chaos-tainted insurrection. The chapter conducts its own intelligence gathering in such situations, attempting to determine whether the rebels are fighting for freedom or serving darker powers. When the Raven Guard conclude that a rebellion has legitimate grievances, they have been known to refuse deployment or to conduct operations that eliminate the corrupt officials while avoiding unnecessary casualties among the rebel forces. These decisions strain relationships with imperial authorities who expect Space Marines to follow orders without questioning the political context. The psychological impact of Istvan V permeates every aspect of chapter culture 10 millennia after the massacre. The betrayal at the drop site remains the defining trauma that shapes how the Raven Guard view other Space Marine chapters and how they approach cooperation with potential allies. The knowledge that 8 legions turned traitor, that warriors who had fought alongside the Raven Guard for decades suddenly became enemies, created a legacy of caution and suspicion that has never fully healed. The chapter maintains cordial relationships with other loyalist chapters and will fight alongside them when circumstances require, but there remains an underlying wariness that prevents the kind of close brotherhood that existed before the heresy. This wariness manifests in operational security measures that exceed what most chapters practice. The Raven Guard share intelligence with allied forces on a need-to-know basis, providing enough information to enable coordination while withholding details about their own capabilities and planned operations. Joint training exercises with other chapters occur rarely, with the Raven Guard preferring to maintain the secrecy around their specialized techniques rather than risk those methods being observed and potentially countered by future enemies. The chapter's librarians maintain psychic wards around their fortresses and ships that would detect infiltration attempts, understanding that the Alpha Legion demonstrated at Istvan V and during the Raptor project that even the most secure facilities could be penetrated by sufficiently skilled operatives. The memory of the corrupted Raptors adds another layer to this trauma. The chapter's apothecaries and chaplains work to ensure that new generations understand what happened during the failed reconstruction effort, using it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of seeking shortcuts or trusting too readily in solutions that seem too effective. The gene laboratories where the Raptor project was conducted remain sealed, their chambers preserved as a reminder of how catastrophic failure can emerge from the most promising beginnings. Some battle brothers who were present during the Raptor project's collapse still serve in the 41st millennium, their lifespans extended by Space Marine physiology and the chapter's gene seed, allowing them to survive for centuries. These ancient warriors carry first-hand memories of executing corrupted brothers and serve as living connections to the chapter's darkest period. The Raven Guard's successor chapters maintain varying degrees of connection with their progenitors, reflecting the diversity of interpretations that different commanders brought to Corax's teachings. The Black Guard remained closest to the parent chapter's operational doctrine, maintaining the void warfare specialization and the emphasis on boarding actions that characterized the Legion's Terran veterans. The chapter operates primarily from fleet assets rather than maintaining a fixed home world, their ships prowling Imperial space in search of enemy vessels to engage. The Black Guard's relationship with the Raven Guard involves regular communication and occasional joint operations, with both chapters sharing intelligence about enemy fleet movements and coordinating void warfare campaigns when their areas of operation overlap. The Revilers diverged more substantially from the parent chapter's approach, developing a combat doctrine that emphasized aggression and psychological warfare in ways that some Raven Guard found troubling. The Revilers maintained the stealth and infiltration capabilities, but combined them with a brutality in close combat that exceeded what Corax had practiced. The chapter's warriors would infiltrate enemy positions silently, then attack with such overwhelming violence that survivors would be traumatized beyond combat effectiveness. This approach achieved results, but created a reputation that made cooperation with other Imperial forces difficult. The Raven Guard maintained formal ties with the Revilers, but avoided joint operations, recognizing that their successor chapter had interpreted Corax's teachings in ways that emphasized different aspects of his philosophy. The Raptors represented an attempt to preserve the adaptability and innovation that the failed Raptor project had been meant to enable. The chapter encouraged its warriors to modify equipment and develop new tactics based on their combat experience, creating a culture where individual initiative was valued over rigid adherence to established procedures. The Raptors maintained close relationships with the Raven Guard, frequently requesting access to the parent chapter's archives and seeking guidance from veteran warriors who could provide historical context for tactical problems. The exchange of knowledge benefited both chapters, with the Raptors' innovations sometimes being adopted by the Raven Guard after field testing demonstrated their effectiveness. Other successor chapters founded from Raven Guard gene seed over the millennia showed similar variations in how they interpreted their Primarch's legacy. Some emphasized the guerrilla warfare aspects, conducting campaigns where they operated behind enemy lines for extended periods. Others focused on the precision strike capabilities, developing specialized units that could eliminate high-value targets with minimal collateral damage. A few chapters struggled with the same gene seed degradation that affected the Raven Guard, their apothecaries working to maintain combat strength despite rejection rates that made recruitment challenging. The diversity among successor chapters reflected the reality that Corax's teachings could be applied in multiple ways, with different commanders emphasizing different aspects based on their own experiences and the threats they faced. The relationships between the Raven Guard and their successors involved more than just tactical coordination. The parent chapter maintained responsibility for monitoring the genetic stability of successor chapters founded from their gene seed, providing support when degradation issues emerged and sharing whatever knowledge the apothecarium had developed about managing the missing organs and other deficiencies. This oversight created a network of chapters that shared genetic heritage and maintained communication even when separated by vast distances. The Raven Guard's master of the apothecarium coordinated with counterparts in successor chapters, exchanging data about gene seed performance and implantation success rates in an ongoing effort to understand and potentially mitigate the degradation that affected all of Corax's genetic legacy. The era Indomitus that followed the Great Rift's opening brought both challenges and opportunities for the Raven Guard. The galaxy-spanning warp storm divided Imperial space into isolated regions where communication and travel became difficult or impossible. The Raven Guard found themselves operating in an environment where their traditional approach of coordinating dispersed forces through careful planning and intelligence sharing became significantly more complicated. Companies that had deployed to distant war zones lost contact with the chapter's leadership, forced to make strategic decisions based on outdated information and their understanding of the chapter's doctrine rather than current orders. The disruption to Imperial supply lines and communication networks created chaos that required every chapter to adapt rapidly or face destruction. The integration of Primaris Marines represented one of the most significant changes to affect the chapter since the Heresy. Robute Guilliman's return and his introduction of new Space Marine technology provided the Raven Guard with warriors whose genetic enhancements exceeded what traditional Space Marines possessed. The Primaris Marines were larger, stronger, and equipped with weapons and armor that incorporated technology the Imperium had not possessed for millennia. The Raven Guard received these reinforcements with cautious appreciation, recognizing that the chapter desperately needed additional strength, but uncertain how warriors created through different processes would integrate with their existing culture and combat doctrine. The initial Primaris reinforcements arrived with limited knowledge of Raven Guard traditions and tactics. These warriors had been trained by Guilliman's forces using Codex standard procedures, emphasizing the kind of direct assault tactics that the Raven Guard had spent 10,000 years moving away from. The chapter's leadership faced the challenge of retraining these Primaris Marines in stealth and infiltration techniques, while also learning how to employ their enhanced capabilities effectively. The Primaris Marines' increased size made them less suited for the kind of covert operations that traditional Raven Guard excelled at, their larger frames more difficult to conceal, and their heavier footfalls harder to silence. The chapter's training cadre worked to adapt their instruction methods, teaching Primaris Marines modified techniques that accounted for their physical differences while maintaining the fundamental principles of Raven Guard doctrine. The new equipment that accompanied the Primaris Marines provided capabilities that the Raven Guard had not possessed previously. The Mk-10 power armor incorporated stealth technology that could dampen sensor signatures, partially compensating for the Primaris Marines' larger size. The bolt rifles that served as their primary weapons offered improved range and accuracy compared to standard bolters, enabling precision fire at distances that traditional Raven Guard marksmen could only achieve with specialized sniper rifles. The impulsor and repulsor grav vehicles provided mobility that complemented the chapter's emphasis on rapid deployment and withdrawal, their anti-gravitic drives allowing them to traverse terrain that would have stopped conventional armored vehicles. The chapter's tech marines studied this new equipment extensively, working to understand its capabilities and limitations. The technology was more sophisticated than what the Raven Guard had maintained previously, requiring additional training for the artificers and support personnel who would maintain it. The grav vehicles in particular demanded expertise that few within the chapter possessed initially, their complex drive systems and power distribution networks unlike anything the Tech Marines had worked with before. The learning curve was steep, but the chapter recognized that mastering this technology would provide significant tactical advantages in the increasingly desperate conflicts that characterized the era in Domitus. The operational capabilities that Primaris reinforcements enabled allowed the Raven Guard to prosecute campaigns that would have been impossible with their previous strength. The chapter could now field multiple company-strength forces simultaneously, deploying to different war zones while maintaining sufficient reserves to respond to emerging threats. The Primaris Marines' enhanced durability meant they could sustain combat operations for longer periods without requiring rest or medical attention, extending the chapter's operational tempo beyond what traditional Space Marines could maintain. The combination of traditional Raven Guard stealth capabilities and Primaris enhanced combat power created a force that could infiltrate enemy positions, strike with devastating effectiveness, and withdraw before the enemy could mount effective counterattacks. The adaptation to galaxy-wide warfare required the Raven Guard to reconsider how they allocated forces and prioritized objectives. The scale of threats facing the Imperium in the era Indomitus exceeded anything the chapter had encountered previously. Entire sectors were being consumed by Chaos incursions, Xenos invasions, or the Tyranid hive fleets that were converging on Imperial space from multiple directions. The Raven Guard could not address all these threats simultaneously, forcing the chapter's leadership to make difficult decisions about which conflicts to engage in and which to leave for other Imperial forces. The chapter master and his command staff maintained constant communication with other chapters and Imperial military authorities, attempting to identify where Raven Guard capabilities could achieve the greatest impact. The defense of the Nachman Gauntlet demonstrated how the Raven Guard operated in this new strategic environment. The Gauntlet represented one of the few stable routes through the Great Rift, making it critical for maintaining communication and supply lines between Imperial forces on either side of the galaxy, spanning Warp Storm. Chaos forces recognized the Gauntlet's importance and launched sustained campaigns to seize control of the systems that formed the corridor. The Raven Guard deployed elements of 4 companies to the region, conducting operations that disrupted Chaos logistics and eliminated key commanders, whose leadership was critical to coordinating the enemy assault. The campaign lasted for years, with Raven Guard forces operating across dozens of systems simultaneously. Strike teams infiltrated Chaos-held worlds and sabotaged supply depots, destroying ammunition stockpiles and fuel reserves that the enemy needed to sustain their offensive. Assassination squads eliminated Chaos champions and sorcerers whose powers or tactical expertise made them force multipliers for the traitor armies. Reconnaissance elements gathered intelligence on Chaos fleet movements, providing early warning of enemy attacks and enabling Imperial Navy forces to position themselves advantageously. The Raven Guard's operations could not stop the Chaos assault entirely, but they degraded the enemy's effectiveness sufficiently that other Imperial forces could hold critical positions and maintain control of the gauntlet. The prophecies and legends surrounding Corax's eventual return have proliferated throughout the chapter's 10,000-year history. The chaplains maintain records of reported sightings and supposed visions that suggest the Primarch still exists in some form, though the reliability of these accounts varies significantly. Some reports come from credible sources, Raven Guard librarians who experienced psychic visions during meditation, or allied forces who encountered a massive figure in black armor fighting against Chaos forces in regions where no loyalist space marines should have been present. Other accounts are less reliable. Third-hand stories pass through multiple sources or claims made by individuals whose mental stability was questionable. The most consistent pattern in these reports involves sightings of a massive entity with Raven characteristics hunting Word-Bearer's forces. Multiple accounts describe a creature that combines human and avian features, its body covered in black feathers, and its eyes burning with cold fury. The entity appears in regions where Word-Bearers are operating, attacking them with overwhelming violence before vanishing without engaging other forces present. Some accounts suggest the creature possesses abilities that defy conventional understanding, moving through solid matter, appearing and disappearing without using conventional transportation, or manifesting multiple instances simultaneously in locations separated by vast distances. The chapter's librarians have attempted to verify these accounts through psychic investigation, using their abilities to search the warp for traces of their Primarch's presence. The results have been inconclusive and often disturbing. Some librarians report sensing something that might be Corax, a consciousness that exists partially in real space and partially in the warp, hunting through dimensions that normal beings cannot perceive. Others encounter only silence or psychic signatures, so corrupted by warp energies that determining their origin becomes impossible. A few librarians who pushed their investigations too far experienced visions that left them traumatized, describing things they witnessed that suggested their Primarch had been transformed by his time in the Eye of Terror into something that only partially resembled what he had been. The theological implications of these accounts create debates within the chapter's reclusiam. Some chaplains interpret the sightings as evidence that Corax continues to serve the Emperor even after 10,000 years, that he has transcended normal existence to become a weapon directed specifically against the Word-Bearers and other traitors. This interpretation provides comfort to battle brothers who want to believe their Primarch remains loyal and purposeful despite whatever transformations he might have undergone. Other chaplains express concern that the entity described in the reports might not be Corax at all, or that it represents what their Primarch has become after millennia of exposure to the warp's corrupting influence, something that serves the Emperor's interests, but has lost the humanity and principles that defined Corax during his mortal existence. The chapter's leadership maintains official agnosticism about these accounts, while privately hoping that some element of truth exists within the accumulated reports. The possibility that Corax might return provides psychological sustenance to warriors who fight in an era where the Imperium faces existential threats from multiple directions. The idea that their Primarch continues to hunt the enemies who betrayed them at Istvan V offers a form of cosmic justice that appeals to the chapter's cultural emphasis on resistance to tyranny and the eventual triumph of freedom over oppression. Whether Corax actually exists in the form described by these accounts matters less than what the belief in his continued existence provides to the chapter's morale and identity. The enduring hope for the Primarch's redemption and return shapes how the Raven Guard view their own future. The chapter understands that they fight in the Emperor's name and serve the Imperium regardless of whether Corax ever returns, but the possibility of reunification with their Gene Father provides motivation that extends beyond simple duty. The Battle Brothers maintain their skills and preserve their traditions with the understanding that if Corax does return, he should find a chapter that still embodies the principles he established. The Fortress Monastery's halls contain shrines where warriors pray for their Primarch's safe return, offering devotions that combine reverence for the Emperor with hope that Corax might someday emerge from whatever realm he currently inhabits. The Raven Guard's future in the 41st millennium remains uncertain in ways that reflect the broader challenges facing the Imperium. The chapter maintains combat effectiveness despite gene seed degradation and limited numbers, but the scale of threats they face continues to escalate. The integration of Primaris Marines provides additional strength, but requires ongoing adaptation of doctrine and training. The galaxy-wide warfare that characterizes the era Indomitus demands that the chapter operate across distances and timescales that strain their ability to maintain coordination and mutual support. The possibility of Corax's return offers hope, but cannot be relied upon as a solution to the practical challenges of fighting in an Imperium that grows more desperate with each passing year. The chapter's warriors understand that they carry forward a legacy established during humanity's darkest hours, when their Primarch led slaves in rebellion against tyranny, and then guided his legion through a civil war that nearly destroyed the Imperium. The principles that Corax taught, that freedom matters more than glory, that precision achieves what brute force cannot, that warriors should fight intelligently rather than simply fighting hard, remain as relevant in the 41st millennium as they were during the liberation of Deliverance. The Raven Guard will continue to strike from shadows, to eliminate the Emperor's enemies through stealth and precision, and to resist tyranny in all its forms. They are the sons of Corax, the liberator of Deliverance, and they will honor his memory through their actions regardless of whether he ever returns to lead them again. The chapter endures, adapting to each new threat while maintaining the core identity that has defined them for 10,000 years, ready to fight for humanity's survival in a galaxy that offers no mercy to the weak or the unprepared.